I received word before dawn that a Golden Lion envoy had wandered near the Red Leaf border. I filed the information under opportunities rather than emergencies. Baron Philip, special envoy of Duke Golden Lion, had apparently taken the scenic route through bandit country. His escort was too small for a man of his own importance. My scouts found him first. That meant the bandits never got the chance to price him properly. I sent 20 riders to rescue him. A rescue costs nothing. A ransom costs everything. I intended to collect both. When my men rode in waving greywood colors, the Baron nearly wept with relief. He mistook armed strangers for salvation instead of a new set of terms. I let him believe that. I let him believe it for exactly as long as it was useful to me. He was escorted to Greywood under a canopy of courtesy. He was given wine. He was given a warm bed. He was given every comfort a valuable asset deserves before someone opens the ledger on him. I met him personally at the gate. I bowed with the precision of a man who has practiced bowing to people he intends to rob. I welcomed him to the safest town in the region. He thanked me 3 times in the first minute. That told me his gratitude was worth roughly nothing. It also told me his name was worth quite a lot. I mentioned, in passing, that the east side of Red Leaf territory held an iron mine of some interest to me. I said it the way a merchant mentions the weather before naming his price. The Baron did not catch the hook. Men who have never been collateral rarely recognize the shape of the hook until it is already in their mouth. I walked him through the town square myself. We passed the granaries and the drilling iron guard. I wanted him to see exactly how much order a man like me could produce. Order, in my experience, frightens hostages more effectively than chains. Chains suggest chaos, and I wanted him to understand he was dealing with a system. By the time we reached the castle, his smile had started to look different. It looked like a tax he was paying rather than an emotion he was feeling. I invited him down to the basement to discuss the particulars of his continued safety. He followed, because polite men always follow the person who saved them. The basement room had 1 table. It had 1 chair for him and 1 chair for me. I made sure mine faced the door. I wanted him to understand who controlled the exits. I sat down and produced a small file. I began working on my nails while he explained things. He grew increasingly nervous as he spoke. He said the Duke would want him returned promptly. I told him I fully intended to return him, in excellent condition. I added that this would happen once we settled a modest security service fee. He asked how modest. I said the number was still under negotiation. It was pending a small parcel of land that had recently caught my professional attention. I did not say ransom. Ransom is a word for criminals, and I run a business. He went pale in a specific way. It was the way men go pale when they realize their body has become a line item. Before he could answer, the door opened without a knock. Victor, Red Leaf's political officer, stumbled in. He looked like a man who had run the entire distance from his lord's hall. He begged me, immediately and without dignity, not to touch the iron mine. He called it the last asset his viscount could not survive losing. I set down the file. I looked at him the way I look at any debtor who has finally understood the invoice. I explained, without raising my voice, that Red Leaf's blacksmiths had already been quietly dying for months. They had been undercut by Greywood ironware I sold at prices their forges could never match. Their guild had not lost the mine yet, I told him. But they had already lost the market it was supposed to feed. Victor's face did the arithmetic before his mouth did. Neither result pleased him. I reminded him gently that Baron Philip belonged to Duke Golden Lion. That Duke was not known for measured responses when his envoys go missing near a hostile border. If harm came to the Baron under Red Leaf's watch, I said, the Duke would not send a strongly worded letter. He would send an executioner for Victor's own viscount. I let that sit in the room. I let it sit for exactly as long as it took Victor's shoulders to drop. I slid the deed across the table. I told him the mine was the only asset that could pay for both the Baron's safe return and his viscount's continued heartbeat. Victor signed with a hand that shook. I found that reassuring, since a steady hand usually means the man plans to renege. Baron Philip watched the whole transaction. He seemed to finally understand that his rescue had been a delivery service with him as the cargo. I had him escorted home within the hour. He went home unharmed, fed, and thoroughly educated on how efficiently Greywood handled logistics. With the mine signed over, my iron supply chain closed into a single loop. It ran from ore to smelter to finished tool, with no foreign hand left to squeeze in the middle. I walked back to the castle counting the mine. I did not count it as territory but as a permanent discount on every nail, plow blade, and crossbow bolt my town would ever need. Back in Greywood proper, the night school had been running for a full month. It had started to pay a return I valued more than any single mine. A serf named Hans once could not have told you the difference between a foot and a yard without guessing. He had learned to calculate material quotas well enough that I promoted him to foreman over an entire lumber crew. I did not promote him out of sentiment. Watching him stand straighter under the new title gave me something close to satisfaction I chose not to examine too closely. I promoted him because a foreman who can count saves me more silver in wasted timber than 10 foremen who cannot. Word of his promotion spread through the barracks and workshops faster than any decree I could have posted. Applications for the night school doubled within days. I took the opportunity to push standardized measuring tools across every workshop in town. Half our waste had never been theft, only sloppy arithmetic dressed up as honest error. I ordered every foreman to submit ledgers using the new units. No exceptions, no charming excuses about how the old rope and notch method had served their father's fine. Anyone caught rounding numbers to make a quota look better than it was would answer to the iron guard. I made sure the punishment described in the notice was specific enough to keep imaginations from wandering toward leniency. Good enough accounting, I announced to the assembled foremen, was simply theft wearing a friendlier coat. Some of the older men grumbled about the new tools. Men always grumble about anything that makes cheating harder. I did not care about their grumbling. A ledger that lies to me costs more than a worker who resents me. The next morning, before I had finished my tea, the system delivered a notification. I had been waiting weeks to see it. The management chaos penalty had quietly eaten into my daily payout since the town outgrew its old bookkeeping. It had finally dropped below the threshold and lifted in full. Population had crossed 10,500. For the first time in a long while, my full daily payout would land uncut. I read the notification twice. Not because I doubted it, but because numbers that pleasant deserve a second look before you trust them. I thought of hands. I thought of the measuring tools, of the ledgers now written in a common standard. I filed the entire month under investments that had finally matured. A town, I decided, is only as profitable as its ability to count itself accurately. Mine had just learned to count. I allowed myself one long breath of something like pride. Then I returned to the morning's correspondence, because pride is a currency I rarely let myself spend. That peace lasted until midday, when Sylvie requested an urgent audience. Sylvie's urgent requests had never once been about good news. She arrived out of breath. For her, that was practically a written report of how bad the situation had become. She told me Lord Redleaf had not taken the loss of his iron mine as a business transaction. He had not taken it the way I had hoped a reasonable man might. He had taken it as a public humiliation. That meant he intended to answer it with something more expensive than a lawsuit. He had sold off the last of his family's gold and jewelry, she said. He liquidated heirlooms that had likely survived 3 generations to fund one bad decision. With that coin he had hired the Blood Wolf Mercenary Company. They numbered roughly 400 men with a reputation for burning what they could not loot. He combined the mercenaries with his remaining 800 knights. He added 1,300 armed serfs, dragged out of their fields and handed spears they barely knew how to hold. Sylvie put the total coalition near 2,500 men. That was more soldiers than I had ever seen gathered against a single town this size. They had battering rams, she added, and barrels of oil. The equipment was meant for one purpose only, and that purpose was to erase Greywood from the map before sunrise. The plan, according to her sources, was a night raid. It was launched under cover of darkness so my walls would have no warning before the rams arrived. Sylvie delivered all of this expecting panic, or at least urgency. Instead, I found myself almost pleased. I told her I had been expecting this since the moment Victor signed the mine over. No lord loses an asset like that without reaching for the nearest sharp object. A humiliated noble with access to his family vault was not a threat, I explained. He was a predictable variable, and predictable variables are the cheapest kind to plan around. Sylvie asked how many men I intended to muster against 2,500. I told her the number of men mattered less than what I planned to do with the ground beneath their boots. I gave the order for full mobilization within the hour. Every able body in Greywood, man or woman, dropped whatever they were doing and reported to the muster points. But I did not form them into ranks. I did not hand out spears for a shield wall. A shield wall against 300 heavy cavalry is a donation, not a defense. Instead, I redirected the entire mobilized population toward infrastructure. That confused half my officers and alarmed the other half. I told Copperhammer, my head blacksmith, that his forges would not sleep tonight. Neither would his crews. The freshly seized iron mine had already started feeding his workshop roar. I intended to spend every scrap of it before midnight. I ordered barbed wire forged in quantities that would have sounded absurd a month earlier. A month earlier, the mine still belonged to someone else. Thousands of serfs were organized into digging crews. They moved out to a line roughly 500 meters in front of the town wall and began cutting trenches into the earth. I put my orc laborers at the head of every crew. They could move earth faster than 3 ordinary men combined and complained about it considerably less. The trenches were not dug straight. A straight trench is easy to gallop across at an angle. I had them zigzag in a pattern designed to break a charge's line rather than merely block it. Behind the first belt of trenches, Copperhammer's crews planted rows of stakes. They wrapped the stakes tight with barbed wire pulled straight from the new forges. Behind the wire, other crews scattered caltrops across the open ground in dense, overlapping fields. The caltrops were small enough to miss in torchlight and sharp enough to cripple any horse that found one. Sylvie walked the line with me as the sun dropped. She stared at the trenches like she was watching me build a grave instead of a defense. She asked, carefully, whether I understood that Red Leaf's knights considered open combat a matter of honor. To them it was a test of steel against steel. I told her honor was not a line item I recognize. I had no intention of meeting 300 heavy cavalry on terms that favored heavy cavalry. This was not a duel, I said. This was a meat grinder, built specifically to take a mounted charge and turn it into scrap before it reached my wall. Cheap industrial engineering, I told her, beats feudal chivalry every single time. Chivalry was designed for men who never had to fight barbed wire. She asked what the knights would think when they realized the town in front of them was undefended in the way they expected. I told her I did not particularly care what they thought in the second before it stopped mattering. I pulled the iron guard back from the open field entirely. I stationed them in concealed positions behind the trench line, crossbows loaded. Their bolts were tipped in the poison our alchemists had been refining for exactly this kind of night. I gave strict orders that no one was to fire early. It did not matter how tempting a lit torch or a shouting knight might look from cover. A charge interrupted too soon regroups, I told my captains. A charge allowed to commit fully never gets the chance to regroup at all. I stationed squads of orc soldiers at the base of the trenches themselves. They were armed with heavy steel axes, with one job only: to finish anything that fell in and still moved. It was not a glamorous assignment. I did not pretend otherwise when I gave it to them, but I paid a bonus for grim work, and orcs have never once turned down a bonus. By the time the sun fully set, the entire 500-meter belt in front of Greywood looked empty from a distance. It looked like nothing at all, empty ground beneath a quiet town. That emptiness was the entire point. A visible trap catches nothing, and an invisible one catches everything. I climbed the watchtower as the last light died. Greywood behind me went darker by design, torches doused, gates shut. Every window was curtained so the town looked asleep rather than armed. Sylvie joined me on the tower with a spyglass. Her face suggested she still expected me to change the plan at the last possible moment. I did not intend to change anything. The plan had already cost me a fortune in iron, and I planned to collect on that investment before dawn. Somewhere past the tree line, torchlight began to gather, small at first. It thickened into a line of fire that stretched wider than I liked to admit even to myself. I counted the lights out of habit the same way I count coins. I stopped somewhere past 2,000 because the exact number no longer changed what I needed to do. Horns sounded from the Red Leaf side, thin and distant. It was the kind of signal men give each other right before they convince themselves that courage is the same thing as certainty. The ground began to hum before it began to shake. A low tremor traveled up through the tower stones long before any horse came into view. Then I saw them. 300 heavy cavalry broke from the tree line at a dead run, lances lowered. Their banners snapped black against a sky with no moon to spare them. Behind the horses came the mercenaries and the armed serfs in a mass too large to count by torchlight. All of it was aimed at a town that looked, from where they stood, like an easy kill. Sylvie's hand tightened on the tower rail beside me. I kept my eyes on the field, watching for the exact moment the front rank would cross the point of no return. The hoofbeats grew from a hum into a roar. They closed the distance between the tree line and my empty-looking trenches faster than any of them understood. I did not move, and I did not give the order yet. Timing, more than iron or coin, was the one asset in this entire operation I could not afford to spend early. I watched the dark shapes of 300 lances thunder closer through the night, committed now, past any point where turning back would save them, and I waited. The knights hit my wire line at a full gallop. For one heartbeat, the whole front rank simply stopped existing as a cavalry formation. High-carbon steel does not glint under a moonless sky. That omission was the entire point of the purchase order. Horses screamed in a register I had never heard before. It was a sound that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with torn muscle. Riders went over the necks of their mounts in stiff arcs. Their own armor turned what should have been a tumble into a controlled fall onto broken ground. I watched from the tower with a ledger open in my head instead of my hands. Counting casualties in real time is accounting with worse lighting, nothing more. Every horse that went down out there was a debt collected. It was collected against a war Red Leaf started without checking whether he could afford to lose it. Some knights kept their seats and steered wide of the wire. They looked proud of their own reflexes for about 4 more strides. Then the ground opened under them. The trenches waited exactly where the wire funneled them to wait. I had them zigzagged so no straight charge could cross without turning first. A horse does not understand a right-angle turn at speed. Neither, it turned out, did the men riding them. They went into the trenches sideways. Armor and animal weight did the rest of the work for me. I had told the foreman 2 meters deep was excessive when they first proposed it. That was back when I was still thinking like a man with a budget instead of a man with an army at his gate. I revised that opinion in real time. I watched 2 meters swallow riders whole with their lances still strapped uselessly to their backs. The ones who survived the fall tried to climb out on the far lip. They met the caltrops we had seated there in the dark. 4 spikes to a piece, one always pointing up no matter how it landed. Boot leather is not armor, whatever the tanners charge you to believe otherwise. I heard a man scream from a spike through the arch of his foot. I felt, honestly, a flicker of professional satisfaction that the batch had held its temper through casting. That is a monstrous thing to feel, and I felt it anyway. Somewhere under the cold arithmetic I understood exactly whose foot that was. I understood exactly whose town he had ridden here to burn. The charge behind the front rank could not see any of this yet. It kept coming, feeding fresh horses into the same grinder at the same pace. 300 heavy cavalry does not turn on a coin. Red Leaf's captains had built their whole plan around momentum. That is a fine plan right up until the ground refuses to cooperate. I had spent 4 months burying steel and digging trenches. I had spent more silver than I like to remember doing it. A lord's pride told him such defenses could not possibly exist. Pride is expensive. Tonight he was paying my price for his. Down in the trenches, Grom was waiting with 200 of his kin. Each one carried an axe that weighed more than most of the knights' shields. A lance is a beautiful weapon on an open field. It is a useless length of firewood in a hole 1 meter wide. The fallen knights learned that distinction in under 3 seconds each. Grom did not wait for them to draw a sword. He swung before the first man had found his footing in the mud. The axe did not care that the man underneath it had a noble name and a coat of arms. I watched orcs work through that trench with the unhurried rhythm of men splitting cordwood. That is what a fight becomes when only one side can actually fight. It was not a battle down there anymore. It was not, in any sense, a battle a bard would want to sing about. It was harvesting. I have never pretended to be sentimental about harvest season. Grom's people did not sing while they worked. They did not gloat either, and I found I respected that more than I expected to. They simply moved down the line, trench by trench. They cleared debt the way I had asked them to. I had promised them land and standing in Greywood for this. Watching them work, I made a private note to make sure that promise arrived faster than I had planned. A chieftain who fights like that for you should never have to wonder if you meant it. From somewhere near the rear of the coalition line, I could make out a knot of banners. They had to be Red Leaf's own guard. I imagined the man himself standing among them. He would have expected screaming horses and confusion for perhaps a minute. He would have expected the ordinary chaos of any charge meeting resistance. What he was getting instead was silence swallowing 300 men. It happened in the space it takes to walk across a courtyard. No fireballs, no war mages, no enchanted ground. Nothing his court wizard could have warned him to prepare for. Just wire ditches and cheap iron spikes. They were purchased at a price that would have embarrassed his treasurer. I let myself imagine his face for a moment. Not because I needed the satisfaction, though I will admit I took some. His confusion was itself useful intelligence. A commander who cannot name the threat cannot counter it. A commander who cannot counter it will keep feeding men into it out of sheer institutional momentum. That was worth more to me than any amount of gloating. I filed the imagined expression away and returned to counting. Behind the stalled cavalry, the second wave had bunched up. It bunched up exactly where a second wave bunches up when the first wave stops moving without explanation. Mercenaries and conscripted serf soldiers, packed shoulder to shoulder in the dark. They stared at a wire fence and a scream they could not place. That was my cue. I gave the order to the tower signalmen without raising my voice. There was nothing left to decide that I had not already decided months ago. 1,000 iron guards had been lying flat behind the trench line since before sundown. They were close enough to smell the coalition's cook fires and disciplined enough not to move. I had drilled that discipline into them myself. It cost considerable expense in wasted training bolts and my own patience. Tonight it paid a return I could not have modeled on paper. They rose together, which from the tower looked like the ground itself standing up. They loaded in the same motion they had practiced 1,000 times in the yard behind the barracks. Repeating crossbows are not elegant weapons. The poison on the bolts is not a fair one. I have never once lost sleep over either fact. The volley went out in a single sheet, aimed low and wide into the packed mass beyond the trenches. You do not aim a saturation volley at individuals, you aim it at density. Men went down in rows. It was the way wheat goes down in front of a scythe when the blade is sharp and the arm behind it does not tire. A second volley followed before the first bodies had finished falling. Reload speed was the entire premise I had bankrupted 3 separate smiths to achieve. The Blood Wolf mercenaries broke first. I want to be precise about the word first, because it happened within seconds of the second volley landing. They had been hired for coin. It was not even generous coin. By the account Sylvie had pulled off one of Redleaf's own paymasters weeks earlier. No banner, no oath, no ancestral land was asking them to die in a ditch they could not even reach. So they simply stopped asking themselves to. I watched the mercenary line dissolve from a formation into a crowd. I watched the crowd dissolve into 100 separate men, each running in whatever direction did not have crossbow bolts in it. That is the difference between an army and a payroll. I had built my whole defense around exploiting it. A man who loves his lord will die for him out of stupidity or loyalty, take your pick. A man who is renting out his sword for the season calculates his own return on investment the moment the math turns bad. I had made very sure the math would turn bad quickly. The serf soldiers behind them had no such option. Running meant abandoning conscripted families to Redleaf's mercy. So they stood longer and died in correspondingly larger numbers for it. I did not enjoy watching that particular arithmetic play out. I want that on some kind of record, even if the record is only in my own head. Every one of those men had been dragged out of a field by a lord who saw them as line items. He saw them exactly the way I was seeing his knights as line items. The resemblance was not lost on me, even mid-battle. I gave the order to press the advantage before the thought could slow me down. Sentiment is a luxury good, and I could not afford to purchase any of it tonight. Counterattack, I told the signalmen. Take as many alive as the men can manage without slowing the line. I had a bounty ready before the order even finished traveling down the tower stairs. I had drafted it 3 days earlier, Along with everything else Sylvie insisted I plan for. 5 copper for every able-bodied man brought in alive and bound. 10 copper for every warhorse captured uninjured enough to be sold or worked. A dead enemy costs me nothing and returns me nothing. A living one, chained and put to work in the coal seam, or ransomed back to whichever lord still had a treasury, returns me labor or silver. Frequently both in sequence. I have never understood generals who celebrate a body count as though corpses paid taxes. My iron guards understood the incentive structure immediately. I had spent 4 months teaching them to understand incentive structures. They went out into the field less like soldiers finishing a battle. They moved more like laborers collecting a crop before rain. Somewhere in that chaos, Sylvie had already found her own target. I caught sight of her from the tower only because her horse was the one still moving with purpose through a field of men moving without any. She ran down a rider trying to break east through the tree line. His armor was too well made for a common knight. I understood exactly who that had to be before I could confirm it. She did not bother closing to a formal engagement. She put her blade into the tendon of his horse's rear leg at full gallop. The cut took the animal down in one stride. It put its rider face first into the mud a half-second later. By the time I could get a proper look, she was standing over him. Her sword rested at the joint of his throat and shoulder, patient as a tax collector at the end of a long route. Lord Redleaf, coalition commander, architect of the knight's investment, was lying in the churned mud of a field he had come to burn. He was disarmed by a woman he likely still thought of as some frontier lord's bodyguard. I would have paid to see his face in that instant. In a very real sense I had, given what the whole campaign had already cost him. The rest of the field finished collapsing within minutes of that capture. An army without its center and without its mercenary backbone is not an army anymore. It is a crowd with weapons wondering why it showed up. I checked the hourglass on the tower sill more out of habit than need. We were not yet an hour into the engagement. 2,500 men, 300 of them heavy cavalry. In under 60 minutes the coalition that had marched on Greywood no longer existed as a fighting force in any sense worth the name. I did not feel triumphant standing there, whatever that is supposed to feel like. I stood like a man who had just watched a very large, very risky order clear. I was already thinking about inventory. Morning came gray and slow, the way it does after a night nobody in the town actually slept through. The fields around Greywood looked like a scrapyard that had lost an argument with itself. I walked the ground at first light with a work crew and a set of ledgers. Grief, if I owed anyone any, was going to have to wait its turn behind logistics. Armor came off every body that had one. It was stripped by teams working in efficient pairs, buckle by buckle. It was stacked onto carts bound for the forge. Good steel does not care whose back it used to cover. My smiths had already told me they could recast half of it into trench-grade wire within the week. I found that thought steadying in a way I chose not to examine too closely. The dead knights, at least, would go on serving Greywood in a form that did not require feeding or housing. That is more than I can say most nobles manage for their people while alive. The living presented a more interesting problem. I mean that in the plainest possible sense. Surviving mercenaries and conscripted serf soldiers, several hundred of them, were roped in lines. They were marched toward the coal seam under Iron Guard escort, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. Some of them would die down there faster than they would have died fighting me. I am not going to pretend otherwise to make the story sit easier. Others would work off whatever debt I decided to assign them. They would walk out of that mine as citizens of a town that at least fed them on a schedule, which was more than their own lords had ever promised. I did not sort them by which future they were more likely to get. That sorting happens later, in the ledger, not on a battlefield at dawn. What mattered this morning was that the coal kept moving and the chains held. Both of those things were true by mid-morning. I stood at the edge of the pit and watched the first column disappear down the ramp. I told myself, not for the first time, that I had not started this war. I had only made sure it ended somewhere I could use. By afternoon I had traded the mud of a battlefield for the mud of my own backyard. Sylvie insisted it was an entirely different kind of mud requiring an entirely different kind of attention. She had not let one night of industrial scale slaughter interrupt the training schedule. I had stopped being surprised by that discipline months ago. Since the poisoning attempt on my life back in the spring, she had put me through this same drill every single day, war or no war. Today apparently did not qualify as an exception worth making. She swept my legs out from under me in the first exchange. She did it with the same clinical lack of ceremony she uses for everything. I hit the dirt hard enough to feel it in my back teeth. "Get up," she said, not unkindly, the way you tell someone to get up when you fully expect them to. I got up. 6 months ago I would have stayed down and complained about the mud on my shirt. 6 months of mornings like this one have retired that particular version of me. I used to carry weight around my middle that I called a symbol of my station. Everyone else called it what it actually was. That weight is gone now, burned off by a training schedule I did not choose and a war I did not want. What is left underneath is lean in a way that still surprises me when I catch my own reflection. She came at me again faster. I let her close the distance instead of backing away. Backing away from Sylvie only ever buys you a few more seconds of losing. I dropped low instead. My hand found the pouch sewn into my sleeve without my eyes needing to check that it was there. A handful of fine ground powder went into the air between us. Nothing lethal, just enough grit and sting to put a half second of hesitation into even a trained knight's eyes. She turned her head a fraction. That was all the opening the plan required. My boot blade was out and pressed flat against the inside of her knee before she finished blinking the grit clear. It stayed close enough to remind her it existed without actually opening the skin. At the same instant, the little crossbow strapped to the inside of my wrist snapped forward against her collarbone. It was close range, more threat than weapon at that distance, but a threat with a poison bolt loaded all the same. She went very still, which from Sylvie is the equivalent of another fighter shouting an alarm. That, she said, is not a technique, that is 3 separate crimes happening to one person at once. I told her a draw is a draw regardless of how many crimes it takes to get there. A dead man does not get to complain about which weapon killed him. No honorable knight fights like that, she said, stepping back. She lowered her guard by exactly the amount required to acknowledge the point without conceding the argument. I agreed with her completely. I told her I had never once claimed to be an honorable knight, only a man who intended to still be alive at the end of every fight I found myself in. She studied the boot blade for a moment, then the wrist crossbow. Her expression was that of a professional recognizing a rival discipline she had not been trained to respect. She called it capitalist self-defense, not entirely as an insult. She told me that a knight fights to win with honor and I fight to make sure the other man has a worse day than I do. I told her that was the most accurate description of my entire personal philosophy anyone had given me since I arrived in this exile. She almost smiled before sweeping my legs out from under me a second time to make sure the lesson stuck. I lay in the dirt of my own backyard, poisoned crossbow still strapped to my wrist. I decided that of all the investments I had made since coming to Greywood, this daily hour of getting knocked down had quietly become one of the better ones. 10 minutes and one very necessary bath later, I was standing in my own basement in a clean silk shirt. It is not an outfit I would have chosen if the setting had not specifically called for the contrast. Lord Redleaf sat on the packed dirt floor in his underclothes, stripped of every mark of rank he had ridden in with. He was tied back to back with Philip, the envoy he had sent me weeks earlier under a truce banner that had not survived contact with either of our tempers. Braziers burned along the walls, throwing heat and orange light across a room. The room did not need to be this warm for any reason except the one I intended. A pair of orcs sat near the door with whetstones and long knives. They worked the blades with the unhurried attention of men who were not actually in a hurry to be anywhere else. Neither of them looked at the prisoners while they worked, which I had specifically requested. Being ignored by an armed orc sharpening a knife is somehow worse than being watched by one. Philip would not meet my eyes. I could not entirely blame him, given that the last time we had spoken I had been the reasonable party. He had been the one carrying an insulting ultimatum from a man who was now tied to him in his underwear. Redleaf, for his part, still had the look of a man trying to locate the exact moment his plan had stopped making sense. He was not finding it. I did not raise my voice. I have found that a calm voice in a room this warm, with this much visible steel, does more work than shouting ever could. I told him plainly that I could have both of them killed quietly before sunrise. The bodies would be found a day's ride from here, dressed as bandit work. No one in his king's court would ever manage to prove it had been anything else. He understood the arithmetic immediately. That told me his earlier confusion on the battlefield had been about tactics and not about intelligence. I let that threat sit in the room for exactly as long as it needed to, unadorned by any further explanation. Over-explaining a threat is the fastest way to make it sound like a bluff. Then I told him I was, as it happened, a generous man. I preferred contracts to funerals whenever the numbers allowed for it. I had Sylvie bring in the document I had drafted before the battle had even finished. I do not write contracts under stress. I write them in advance and wait for the moment the other party is ready to sign. 3 clauses, I told him, nothing more. Nothing he would not be able to read for himself once his hands were free enough to hold a pen. The first opened every border of his territory to any serf who wished to leave for Greywood. No exit tax, no pursuit, no punishment for the families left behind. He started to object to that one specifically. I let him get exactly 1 sentence into the objection before reminding him, in the same even tone, that the alternative to signing was the bandit story I had already described in some detail. He stopped objecting. The second clause waived every customs duty on goods moving between his territory and mine. By extension, it covered anything moving through the Golden Eagle Merchant Guild's routes that touched either border. That single clause, more than any battlefield outcome, was going to determine how much of his remaining tax base still belonged to him in a year's time. I suspect some distant part of him understood that even through the humiliation. The third clause was, on its face, almost an afterthought. I delivered it that way on purpose. 1,000 gold coins, the whole of what remained in his treasury after funding this campaign, transferred to me as compensation. I described it, without changing my expression, as the inconvenience of his men getting lost on my land and damaging my fence. Philip made a sound that might have been a laugh if the circumstances had allowed for one. He quickly turned it into a cough when Redleaf's expression cut toward him. Redleaf's hand shook badly enough that Sylvie had to steady the parchment against the small table we had set up for exactly that purpose. He signed all 3 clauses anyway. A shaking hand still counts as a signature. The alternative I had offered him remained on the table the entire time, quiet and specific and never once repeated. I took the parchment back once the ink had set. I rolled it with the same care I give any document worth its weight in future silver. I told him that Greywood would remember this arrangement as fondly as his own treasury was about to remember it poorly. He did not answer. I did not need him to. I left the basement with the contract under my arm. The orcs kept sharpening knives behind me for no reason now except habit. I climbed the stairs back toward a house that smelled, for the first time in 2 days, like nothing was currently on fire. Somewhere above me, Sylvie was probably already resetting the training yard for tomorrow morning. A war ending is not, in her professional opinion, a reason to skip a lesson. I found I did not mind that in the slightest, given how the last one had turned out. 20,000 refugees now packed inside my walls. I had assumed the hard part was already behind me. I was wrong about that. Feeding a population is arithmetic, simple columns that balance if you work them. Uniting one is chemistry. And chemistry explodes. The fights started small, the way rot always starts small. A shove at the well line. An insult about someone's dead hometown, muttered just loud enough to be heard. Within a month those small sparks were burning through my labor force at a rate that made my ledger physically hurt to look at. Steelworkers who once called Redleaf home refused to share a drying line with anyone from Black Iron territory. Coal haulers from the eastern hills brawled with farmers from the southern plains. The argument was over which group had first claim to a broken well pump, a pump that produced no water for either of them while they fought over it. Dozens of blacksmiths limped into the infirmary with cracked knuckles and split scalps. Every one of them insisted the other side started it. Gareth's guards spent more hours pulling grown men off each other than they spent training. More hours than they spent patrolling my perimeter too, which was the part that worried me. Every asset I owned was a body. Bodies with broken hands do not swing hammers. Bodies with broken hands do not load ore carts either. Steward Baal came to me holding a casualty report so long it needed 2 hands to carry. His composure, usually his most reliable feature, was gone entirely. He told me the town was one bad payday away from a riot. He said Gareth's 40 guards could never contain a riot that size. I listened to him list territorial grudges going back generations. Feuds over rivers and borders that meant nothing here, in a town built from nothing. I felt only irritation at the waste of it. None of these people were fighting over food. None of them were fighting over coin either. Which meant the fight itself was the disease, not the shortage. I did not see red leaf refugees when I looked at the ledgers. I did not see black iron refugees either. I saw redundant labels stamped on interchangeable labor units. Labels that cost me productivity get deleted. So I deleted them. I ordered every hometown designation stricken from the settlement registry within 3 days. No exceptions. No appeals. Housing got reassigned by trade rather than by birthplace. The decision made Baal go pale before he even finished reading the order aloud. Steelworkers moved into one district together. It did not matter which burned village they had crawled out of. Coal miners went into another district. Farmers went into a third. Masons and carpenters went into a fourth, and so on down my entire employment roster. A man who once swore vengeance on his neighbor for a border dispute now shared a bunkhouse wall with him. Both of them swung the same kind of hammer. Both of them earned the same kind of wage. I gathered the district foreman in the square. I told them plainly that red leaf people and black iron people no longer existed within my walls. There were only steelworkers now. Only miners. Only farmers. Only citizens of Greywood Town. Every other identity was retired, effective immediately. I told them that a man who wanted to keep fighting over which ruined village he used to sleep in was welcome to leave. He could go rebuild that village himself, brick by brick on his own time. Anyone caught starting a fight over regional pride again, I said, could explain their nostalgia to the inside of my blast furnace. I never intended to feed a single person to molten iron, obviously. Dead workers generate no revenue whatsoever. But fear is a cheap tool. A man imagining his own cremation rarely finishes the thought before deciding to walk away instead. The brawls dropped within a week. Not because I had healed old wounds. Because I had made those wounds irrelevant to daily survival. A shared trade and a shared wage packet turn out to be a far stronger glue than a shared flag ever was. Baal called it the coldest thing he had ever watched a lord do to his own people. I called it consolidating 20,000 liabilities into one manageable workforce. I went back to my ledgers satisfied. The relief did not last long. The moment one crack sealed, another one opened beneath it. This new problem was stranger than gang violence. On paper, my treasury looked healthier than it had ever been. Duke Golden Lion's gold compensation from the Red Leaf incident had filled my vaults to a level I once only dreamed about. I was, by any reasonable accounting, a wealthy lord sitting on a mountain of gold and silver bars. And yet nearly 15,000 of my people could not be paid on any given afternoon. The problem was never the size of my wealth. It was the shape of it. Gold bars and silver ingots do not buy a loaf of bread. They do not buy a mug of beer at the market stall. Only small coin does that. Copper and low-denomination silver, the currency of daily survival, did not exist in enough physical quantity within my borders. I needed thousands upon thousands of tiny coins changing hands every single evening. My mint could not strike them fast enough to matter. Payday became a battlefield of its own. Workers lined up for their wages only to be told the coin box had run dry before reaching the back of the line. Men who had survived orc raids were now screaming at my paymasters over 3 missing coppers. Men who had survived regional feuds too, standing in the same line, fists clenched over the same shortfall. Baal reported 2 near riots in a single week. Both were triggered by nothing more dramatic than insufficient change. I sat with the problem the way I sit with every problem, stripped of sentiment. I looked only at the mechanism that was failing. The mechanism was simple. Physical metal cannot scale fast enough to match 15,000 daily wage payments. If metal could not scale, then metal was not going to be my currency going forward. I had Copper Hammer, my head engineer, brought to my study. I asked him a question that made his eyebrows climb his forehead. I asked whether he could build me a press capable of stamping identical marks onto paper at speed. He said he could, given steel gears and movable type. Within 2 weeks he delivered exactly that. I watched the first sheets roll off his machine. Each one was stamped with my personal seal and the words Greywood Town Labor Union Voucher. Each voucher carried a fractional denomination. Small enough to buy a single loaf. Small enough to buy a single mug. Small enough to cover a single night's rent. I announced to the assembled foreman that from this point forward, a portion of every wage would be paid in these vouchers instead of coin. Ball looked at the stack of printed paper as though I had just proposed paying his own daughter's dowry in dead leaves. He told me, quite directly, that handing armed and desperate workers what was functionally worthless paper was an act of lunacy. He reminded me these were men who had just finished rioting over missing coppers. I was proposing to pay them in something with no metal in it at all. I told him the paper was not worthless. Worth is not a property of the material. It is a property of what the material can be exchanged for. As long as a voucher could buy bread at my bakery, it functioned as hard currency. As long as it could buy beer at my tavern, the same held true. As long as it could cover rent at my housing office, its value stayed intact, regardless of what it was printed on. I owned the bakery. I owned the tavern. I owned the housing office. Which meant I controlled the redemption chain from end to end. Unlike gold, which any bandit or rival lord could melt down and walk away with, this paper was worthless to anyone outside my own market system. That made it, in practical terms, the single most secure currency in the entire North. Its value existed only inside the walls I controlled. I rolled the vouchers out gradually. I backed the first batches publicly with visible reserves so the workers could see the paper was never disconnected from real goods. Within days the Lord's marketplace was thick with rustling paper changing hands for bread. For nails. For mugs of watered beer. Payday riots stopped entirely. Not because I had solved a shortage of wealth. Because I had solved a shortage of exchangeable proof of wealth. Ball admitted grudgingly that the paper worked. He still refused to accept any of his own salary in it. I let him keep his coin. A nervous steward with his own preferred payment method is still a functioning steward. For a short stretch, Greywood Town actually felt stable. In my experience, that is usually the moment before the next disaster introduces itself. This one arrived on horseback. 30 riders in white and gold armor, cresting the ridge above my still unfinished outer wall. Gareth rode in to report Knights Templar at the gate. I noted with some interest that his voice cracked slightly on the word Templar. Leading them was a senior inquisitor of the Church of Light, a man introduced to me as Bishop Macbeth. I already understood, before anyone explained a single detail, exactly who had sent him. Duke Golden Lion had lost his gold. He had lost his leverage. He had lost his composure. This was his revenge, delivered through someone else's soldiers. The formal accusation, when it reached me, was heresy. Specifically, that I harbored unclean races and burned demonic black poison stones inside my walls. The unclean races were my orcs, laborers who mined and hauled with more discipline than half my human workforce. The demonic poison stones were my coal, the substance currently keeping every forge in this town alive. An inquisition with the authority to search my territory for heresy was not an inconvenience. It was an existential threat to every asset I had built. I did not reach for a sword. I did not reach for a war plan either. 30 knights and one furious bishop cannot be fought. They can only be managed. I gave my orders within the hour. Every one of them was theater dressed up as devotion. I had every street scrubbed clean of soot before the delegation's boots ever touched the ground. Scrubbed clean of coal dust as well. Scrubbed clean of anything that looked remotely industrial. I ordered every worker still covered in furnace grime to hang a wooden cross around his neck. It did not matter whether he owned a shred of faith or not. Then came the piece I am still, in some private corner of myself, proud of. I had my blast furnaces, the ugliest and most valuable structures in my entire territory, painted white. I had them crowned with gold sunburst emblems of the god of light. By the time Macbeth's column reached my gate, Greywood Town looked less like an industrial settlement. It looked more like an overzealous monastery. I met him personally at the threshold. I knelt in the dirt to kiss his ring before he had even dismounted fully. I let my voice tremble with exactly the right amount of manufactured reverence. I welcomed him to what I called the humblest of the God of Light's provinces. He studied me the way a butcher studies livestock, calculating rather than convinced. But he let me speak. I told him the coal his report described as demonic poison stone was in truth a purification stone. A gift from the god of light himself, mined here as a sign of divine favor. I told him the orcs were not unclean beasts kept as allies. They were wild creatures I had redeemed through hard labor, working off the sins of their savage nature one shift at a time. Somewhere behind us, entirely undermining my sermon, the orc chieftain Grom bellowed across the yard. He was demanding an extra ration of meat for his crew. I kept my expression pious and unbothered. As though a starving orc yelling about food was itself a form of prayer. Macbeth's face told me he had not swallowed one syllable of it. Frankly, I would have been insulted if he had. A man who rises to senior inquisitor does not get there by believing every peasant lord who suddenly discovers religion in front of an armed escort. He began speaking of proper procedure. Of bringing in a priest gifted with truth-sensing magic to verify my claims beneath the surface. That was the sentence I had been waiting for. A magical search was the one variable I could not paint white or hang a cross on. I interrupted him with an invitation to discuss the matter somewhere more private. Away from the ears of his own knights. He hesitated only a second before following me. That hesitation told me everything about the kind of man I was dealing with. I led him alone into a back room where 3 iron chests sat waiting. Already unlocked. Already gleaming. I lifted the lids myself. I let him look down at 50,000 freshly minted silver coins stacked in even, deliberate rows. I dropped the pious trembling from my voice entirely. I spoke to him as one transactional mind speaks to another. I told him I understood precisely why Duke Golden Lion had sent him. Political convenience explains itself without needing to be dressed in scripture. I called the chests in front of him a First Atonement donation. A gesture of goodwill from a humble province eager to remain in the church's good graces. I told him that if Greywood Town were left to operate under the church's quiet blessing, 10,000 additional silver coins would arrive at his private residence. Every single month going forward. I watched greed cross his face and displace whatever residual conviction had been sitting there a moment earlier. He closed the lid on the nearest chest himself. A small gesture that told me the negotiation was already finished. Within the hour, Bishop Macbeth stood before his own knights. He declared Greywood Town a sacred site touched by divine miracle. He wrote it into the official church record himself, in his own hand. Before he'd even finished his cup of watered wine. I watched his column ride out through my gate with considerably lighter saddlebags on his horse. And a considerably lighter conscience in his chest. I calculated the 10,000 monthly silver against the value of an unmolested workforce. I found the trade laughably favorable to me. A bribed inquisitor is simply another recurring operating expense. I had already learned to budget for far worse ones. I turned to walk back toward the square, already mentally returning to voucher circulation numbers. Gareth intercepted me with a strange report. He told me one member of the church delegation had not left with the rest of the column. A low-ranking nun, he said, had gone missing somewhere inside town during the commotion of the departure. I felt no urgency about a missing cleric at first. Then Gareth added that no one seemed to know whether she had wandered off or simply stayed behind on purpose. Sylvie joined the search without waiting for me to ask. She was already pulling her jacket on as she headed for the door. We searched the districts nearest the gate first. Then we worked inward through the worker housing rows where visitors rarely bothered to wander. We found her in one of the roughest shacks in the mining district. Kneeling on a dirt floor beside an injured miner. His wrist had been crushed under falling rock. The bone visibly wrong beneath torn skin. Blood soaking through a makeshift bandage. The nun had her hands pressed against the wound. A faint pale light gathered at her fingertips, her healing magic clearly straining against the damage. Her robes were smeared with dirt and dried blood. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Exhaustion sat heavy under her eyes. She introduced herself, without looking up from her work, as Cecilia. She kept both hands locked on the miner's wrist. Gareth moved forward as though to pull her away for questioning. I raised a hand to stop him. I asked her plainly why she had let her own delegation ride off without her. She answered without any of the practiced piety I had just spent the afternoon performing for her superior. She said the delegation only cared about the weight of the treasure chests loaded onto their horses. Not about a laborer bleeding out in the mud 2 streets away. She said every priest in Macbeth's retinue had walked past this shack without slowing their pace. She could not make herself do the same. She told me she understood she had likely broken some rule of her order by staying. She would accept whatever punishment I decided to hand her. Her only request was that I let her finish stabilizing the miner first, before I said another word about consequences. I found, to my own mild surprise, that I was amused rather than annoyed by her defiance. I told her I had no intention of punishing a woman for the crime of doing her actual job better than her entire chain of command. I crouched beside the miner. I looked at the wound with the eyes of a man who has read considerably more about medicine than this world currently practices. I told her that her light magic had done well to stop the bleeding. Bleeding was never the true danger in a wound like this one. I explained that without proper cleaning and dressing, an infection would set into that torn flesh within days. Infection kills a man slower and worse than the injury itself ever could. I called infection an invisible demon, one she had clearly never been trained to fight. The church teaches light magic and calls the job finished. She looked at me the way a student looks at a teacher who has just described a threat she never had a name for. I turned to Baal, who had caught up with us by then. I gave him an order on the spot. I told him to requisition one of the sturdier buildings near the town center. Convert it immediately into a proper hospital. I specified strong distilled liquor for disinfecting wounds. I specified boiled gauze for dressing them, both details Baal wrote down without asking a single question this time. I named the building on the spot, the First Staff Hospital of Greywood Town. I told him I wanted it stocked and operational within the week. Then I turned back to Cecilia. I made her an offer that, judging by her expression, no one in her order had ever extended to her before. I offered her command of that hospital, with the title of Chief Medical Officer of Greywood Town attached to it. I offered her a paid staff pulled from my sharpest factory girls, trained under her to assist with dressing wounds and managing patients. I offered her a full salary of 1 silver a day, paid the same as my senior foreman, not the token stipend her church likely handed her. I told her plainly that in my territory, every worker who kept breathing and kept swinging a hammer was an asset worth protecting. Protecting assets was simply good management. She sat back on her heels, hands still faintly glowing. She stared at me as though recalculating everything she thought she understood about this town. She told me the church had only ever taught her that healing was a resource reserved for nobles and clergy, something rationed carefully away from common serfs. She said she had watched peasants die of wounds far smaller than this miner's, while priests in her own chapter tended to a duke's sprained ankle. Her eyes were wet by the time she finished speaking. She never let a single tear actually fall in front of me. She accepted the position before I had even finished explaining the hours. She said something quiet about finally understanding where true holy light might actually be found. It was not inside any cathedral she had ever knelt in. I did not correct her framing. A devoted chief medical officer who believes she is doing holy work treats patients better than one who believes she is doing a job. I left Baal to sort out the building requisition. I walked back toward my study with the day's full ledger running through my head. A dissolved regional conflict. A functioning paper currency. A bribed inquisitor riding home satisfied. A hospital now under construction, all closed out before nightfall. I catalogued Cecilia mentally the way I catalog every valuable hire. Not as a woman moved by compassion. As a healing asset now permanently secured under my seal. I never once said the word compassion out loud that day. Not to Baal. Not to Gareth. Not to Cecilia herself. And yet every order I gave, from the hospital to the salary to the staff of trained assistants, existed for no reason except keeping people alive who had no other reason to expect it. I told myself, as I always do, that a healthy workforce simply produces more value than a dying one. I let that explanation sit comfortably on top of whatever else might have been underneath it. Somewhere behind me, in a converted shack turned nightly into a hospital ward, a nun who had once believed healing belonged only to the wealthy was teaching factory girls how to save a miner's hand. I decided that particular transaction, unlike most of the ones that crossed my desk, was one I did not need to examine any further. Greywood Town had survived gang war, a currency crisis, and an inquisition in the span of a single season, and I intended to make sure it survived whatever arrived next as well. The population ledger crossed 25,000 on a morning I had circled in red ink for 2 weeks. By evening my old steward Ball had not slept in 3 days. I found him in the records room surrounded by towers of ration slips. Voucher stubs rose in their own separate tower beside them. Material loss tallies made a third pile, taller than the other two. His hands shook too badly to hold the brush steady. He tried to stand when I entered. He knocked over an inkstone instead. The black pool spread across a column of numbers he had spent an hour reconstructing. He dropped to his knees to blot the mess with his sleeve rather than look at me. That single choice told me more about his state of mind than any confession could have. He asked my forgiveness before I had said a single word. His voice cracked on the second sentence like a plank under too much weight. He confessed that the double-entry method I had taught the clerks made sense to him in daylight. It evaporated from his skull the moment he tried to apply it to 25,000 souls worth of grain and coin. He said his eyes could no longer track a column past 40 lines without the digits swimming. 3 nights of trying anyway had only produced errors he then had to hunt down by candlelight. He said he understood if I intended to set him aside for a younger, sharper mind. He said he would accept it as fair payment for failing me. I catalogued the scene the way I catalog everything. An asset in visible decline, first line item. A system that had outgrown the one man running it by hand, second line item. A loyalty so absolute it mistook exhaustion for betrayal, third line item. Somewhere underneath the ledger arithmetic I felt a specific, useless anger. It is the kind that comes from watching a good man break himself trying to be adequate to a job I had built too large for one pair of hands. I told him to stand. When his knees would not cooperate, I pulled him up by the arm myself. The action cost me nothing. It clearly cost him something he did not have words for. I informed him that discarding him had never once entered my calculations. A steward who works himself past collapse, rather than confess a failing early, is worth more to me than 10 clerks who could recite the ledger format from memory. I told him the actual failure belonged to me. I had handed one man an accounting system built for a nation and expected him to run it like a village headman with a stick and a bag of beans. He stared at me as though I had switched languages mid-sentence. I let the silence sit there while I worked out how to reorganize 25,000 people's worth of bureaucracy on the spot. Past 30,000 residents, a settlement stops behaving like a large household. It starts behaving like a small nation. Nations do not run on the goodwill of one exhausted old man. Nations run on structure. They run on departments that do not need to trust each other, only to execute their piece of the machine correctly and pass the output down the line. I decided, standing in that ink-stained room, that Greywood Town needed something with a name heavy enough to make people take it seriously. It also needed to be hollow enough that no single person inside it could see the whole shape of the operation. I named it the Greywood Town Government Affairs Committee. I made Ball its honorary chairman before he had finished blinking the fatigue out of his eyes. I explained that chairman did not mean clerk. From that day forward he would never again touch a ration slip or a voucher stub with his own hand. Underneath him I would install a cohort of younger literate graduates from the night school. These were the ones who could still hold a column of 40 numbers steady in their heads without their vision blurring. They would do the arithmetic. He would do what only decades of trust could do, which was stand at the head of the room and make people believe the numbers were honest. I watched something loosen in his shoulders as I said it. It was the particular unclenching of a man who expected the axe and received a chair instead. I did not tell him that the chair was also a cage. It was built precisely so his failing memory could never again become a choke point for 25,000 people's food supply. From there I mapped the rest of the town onto the same logic. A crisis is the cheapest possible moment to restructure an entire administration without anyone questioning why. Ella would run agriculture outright. She would have full authority over seed stock, field rotation, and the fertilizer experiments she had been begging me to fund for a month. Cecilia would run health. The clinic, the quarantine sheds, and every apprentice healer the night school had produced would answer to her alone. Copper Hammer, my blacksmith, would run industrial production. That meant the forges, the glassworks, and every workshop that turned raw material into something sellable. Gareth would run security. He would keep the militia and the wall rotations under one clear chain of command, instead of the patchwork of favors it had been. Sylvie would run intelligence and special operations. I chose that title specifically because it sounded dull enough that nobody outside my inner circle would ask what it actually covered. And Baal, at the center of it, would finally get the treasury he deserved. It would be built from the best mathematics students the night school had turned out. Boys and girls who could add faster than he ever could, and who would never once think to question why he still signed every final page. I told him plainly that none of his new clerks needed to understand anything beyond their own slice of the operation. This was not a flaw in the design. It was the entire point of it. A clerk who only sees grain intake cannot sell out my food reserves to a rival. He has no idea what the reserves total, only what passed through his own hands that day. A treasury boy who only balances copper against silver has no way to guess how much gold moves through channels he will never be shown. Divide the machine into enough small, isolated gears. No single gear, however corrupted or captured, can then tell an enemy anything that matters. Only I would ever hold the full shape of the ledger in my head. That meant only I could ever be robbed of everything at once, and I intended to keep it that way. I watched Baal absorb this the way a man absorbs a lesson he is too tired to argue with and too honest not to recognize as sound. He asked, in a voice steadier than it had been all morning, whether this meant he had not failed me after all. I told him that a man who works himself to the edge of collapse, trying to shoulder more than any human being should carry alone, has never once failed me. The failure of design belonged to my desk, not his. He did not cry, because 40 years of service had trained that reflex out of him. His eyes went bright in a way I chose not to comment on. I turned the conversation back to logistics before either of us had to sit with the moment any longer than necessary. Sentiment is expensive, and I had a committee to finish drafting. I had him draft the committee charter that same afternoon. It listed departments, reporting lines, and a treasury audit schedule I intended to review personally once a week. I specified that department heads would report only their summarized totals upward, never their raw internal workings. That kept the full picture assembled nowhere but in the one ledger I alone controlled. Baal, revived by having a task shaped small enough to finish before sundown, began listing which night school graduates he wanted for the treasury. He did this before I had even asked him to choose. I noted, privately, that this was the fastest I had seen him move in a month. It confirmed my suspicion that what had been breaking him was not the work itself, but the shape it had been forced into. While we were still bent over the draft charter, the door banged open without so much as a knock. Ella came through it with dirt on her hands and a grin she had clearly not tried to control. She announced that the new fertilizer mixture had done more than we projected. The wheat in the eastern fields was already heading out half a month ahead of the normal cycle. She rattled off soil composition numbers and growth measurements faster than Baal's new clerks could have written them down. She was practically vibrating with the kind of pride that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with watching something grow because of your own hands. I told her the results were acceptable. In my own head that translated to something closer to relief, though I kept that translation strictly internal. Half a month of accelerated harvest meant grain reserves arriving early. That was precisely the window when I expected the surrounding baronies to start making trouble rather than trade. I did not say that part aloud to either of them. A steward recovering from collapse and a farmer riding a wave of good news did not need my calculations about the coming conflict layered on top of their good day. I let Ella finish describing her yield charts. I thanked her in the flattest tone I could manage. I watched her leave, already planning the next field to treat. 2 good outcomes in one afternoon, a rescued steward and an accelerated harvest. I cataloged both the way I catalog every asset, useful, on schedule, and arriving exactly when I would need them. 200 kilometers away, in a capital that still thought of me as an embarrassment my family preferred not to discuss, my older sister Serena was reading reports about that same asset column. She liked none of what she saw. Serena had inherited what remained of the Violet Merchant Guild, a house our family had once been proud of. Duke Golden Lion had spent the better part of a year quietly strangling it. He had leaned on shipping contracts. He had pressured warehouse owners. He had turned half our old trading partners against renewing so much as a single grain contract. He had done it all without ever raising his voice in public. Serena managed what was left of it from a townhouse with fewer servants each season. She balanced books that bled a little more read every month no matter how she rearranged the numbers. Sylvie's reports had been reaching her through channels Serena still believed were her own network. She was unaware that most of what she read had been shaped before it ever left Greywood Town. Even shaped and softened, the reports were difficult for her to believe. A militia that now fought like a standing army, one detail she could not reconcile. A paper currency circulating with no precious metal behind it that anyone could find, a second. A rival lord's forces wiped from the field in a single engagement, a third. She read the account of Red Leaf's destruction 3 times, by Sylvie's own account. Only then did she set it down and stare at the wall for a long while. The younger brother she remembered had been a drunk with a reputation for gambling debts and worse company. He had been exiled from the capital more as a mercy to the family name than as a punishment. Nothing in that memory explained an army, a currency, or a settlement crossing 25,000 residents in under a year. Whatever she believed or did not believe about the reports, one fact remained undeniable to her. The Violet Merchant Guild was dying, and Pride had never once paid off a creditor. She sat down that night and wrote to me. She wrote not as the older sister who had signed off on my exile without a word of objection, but as a merchant staring at bankruptcy from 6 months away. Her letter dropped every trace of the superiority she used to carry when she spoke to me. In its place was a plainness that told me exactly how frightened she actually was. She asked whether I had built anything, any product at all, that might let the Violet Merchant Guild slip past the Duke's blockade before the last of our warehouses went to auction. She did not ask as a duchess in waiting issuing an order to an inconvenient younger brother. She asked as one businesswoman asking another for a lifeline, and that distinction was not lost on me. The letter would not reach me for several days yet. It traveled by the same slow, deniable channels Sylvie used for everything that could not be trusted to an open courier. While it traveled, I was 2 kilometers outside Greywood Town, in a walled compound. The townspeople had learned to give it a wide berth after the 3rd explosion in as many months. We called it, with the sort of dry humor that keeps men from panicking, the Chemical Experimentation Facility. The name did nothing to make the scorch marks on the outer wall less alarming to visitors. I stood over a bank of clay retorts with a crude gas mask strapped across my face. Leather and glass and boiled canvas, it fit badly and smelled worse. It kept the worst of the fumes out of my lungs at least. Copper Hammer worked beside me in a mask of his own design. He watched the temperature of the coal tar with the focused patience of a man who had already lost 2 sets of eyebrows to this exact process. Dry distillation is unforgiving work. Heat the tar too fast, and you lose the fraction you want to the same fire that is cooking it. Heat it too slow and the whole batch turns to worthless sludge. We had ruined 11 previous batches chasing the correct temperature curve. I had catalogued every one of those failures as tuition rather than loss. In my ledger, nothing that teaches you something is ever wasted capital. This 12th batch behaved the way the notes from my old world said it should. When we drained the condensate off, the liquid that came out was pale and thin. It carried a sharp smell, in exactly the way I remembered kerosene ought to. Copper Hammer held the vial up to the light with the reverence most men reserve for gemstones. He turned it slowly, as though it might change its mind about existing. I did not share his awe, only his relief. A working refining process meant one more input I no longer had to improvise my way around. The lamp itself had taken longer to perfect than the fuel. Greywood's glassworks was still a young operation, staffed by apprentices who had blown out more failed chimneys than they cared to count. I had specified an adjustable wick mechanism. A small brass gear could raise or lower the flame's height. The glass chimney was shaped to choke off wind without choking off the flame it was protecting. The version Copper Hammer and I assembled that afternoon was crude by any standard I remembered from my old life. Rough soldered brass, imperfect glass, a faint bubble trapped near the base. None of that mattered once I filled the reservoir. I trimmed the wick. I struck a spark to it. The flame that came up was steady, bright, and nearly white. It was a light that made every tallow candle and oil lamp I had ever used in this world look like something apologizing for itself. No flicker. No soot climbing the glass. No smoke curling toward the ceiling, the way every other light source in this world produced without exception. Copper Hammer stood in front of it without speaking for long enough that I checked whether the fumes had gotten to him. Then he asked, in a rough voice, how much a single lamp like this might sell for among people who had never seen anything like it. I told him that was precisely the question worth answering. The answer was going to be considerably larger than the cost of the materials sitting on the table. It was in that same room, fuel batch cooling and lamp still burning between us, that Sylvie arrived with a courier pouch. She wore the particular expression that told me a letter's contents had already told her something worth watching my face for. I broke the seal. I recognized Serena's handwriting immediately. I read a page that dropped every ounce of the Polish and distance our family correspondence usually carried. She wrote plainly about failing contracts, about warehouses standing half empty, about the Duke's blockade tightening with every season. Then she asked her question about a product that might let her slip past all of it. I read it twice, the second time slower than the first. I felt the specific, contained amusement of watching a piece fall onto a board exactly where I had left space for it. I did not feel triumph over her, not precisely. That distinction mattered enough to me that I sat with it for a second longer than the letter strictly required. Whatever history sat between us, she had written to me as a peer asking for help rather than as a superior issuing a demand. Something in me filed that fact under credit rather than under contempt. Sylvie, reading my expression rather than the letter itself, asked whether I intended to simply hand the kerosene lamp technology to the Violet Merchant Guild and let Serena save the family business with it. I told her that would be the single worst use of a genuinely valuable product I could imagine. I laid out the reasoning the way I lay out every decision, in terms of where the money would actually end up. The Violet Merchant Guild is not merely struggling, it is drowning in debt owed to creditors who would seize any sudden profit the moment it appeared on the books. Our mother still sits atop that company in practice if not in title. Our mother has never once hidden her preference for our older brother Arthur, or her contempt for the son she considers a stain on the family name. Inject a revolutionary product into a company controlled by a woman who despises me and adores Arthur, and I could predict the outcome without needing a single report from Sylvie. The profits would be seized by creditors first. Whatever survived that would be funneled toward Arthur's ventures rather than mine. I would have handed over the single most valuable trade secret in this world's current market and recouped nothing for it. That is not generosity, it is simply theft with extra paperwork. Sylvie asked, reasonably, what I intended to do instead, since refusing outright seemed to leave Serena exactly where she started. I told her I had no intention of saving the Violet Merchant Guild. I had every intention of saving Serena. Those had stopped being the same problem the moment our mother took over the company's actual decisions. The distinction is simple once you stop thinking in terms of family loyalty and start thinking in terms of which entity actually deserves the investment. I would help her personally, quietly, through a channel that never touched the family company or the family name at all. I laid out the design for her that same evening. I dictated it to Sylvie in pieces between checking the lamp's flame for stability. Serena would need to set up a new trading company from nothing, small, low profile, carrying no visible connection to either of us. I told her to route the registration through some minor fallen nobleman. He would be the sort of man with an old title and no money, willing to lend his name to a venture in exchange for a quiet percentage and no questions asked. The company would need a name that meant nothing to anyone who went looking for it. I suggested Nightingale, mostly because it sounded harmless and slightly poetic, which is exactly the tone a luxury venture needs. Nightingale would not sell lamps. Not at first, not as lamps at all. I told her to package the device as an alchemical curiosity, something rare and half mystical. I told her to give it a name with enough theater in it to survive a countess's dinner table. Tears of the Goddess of Light. Rarity sells itself in that world far better than utility ever does. A name like that does more marketing work than any honest description of coal tar distillation ever could. The opening move would cost her nothing but a handful of lamps given away free to exactly the wrong sort of noblewoman. The vainest, status-hungry countesses in the capital, the kind who cannot bear to be seen with anything less impressive than what her rivals own. Let 5 or 6 of them light their private chambers with something brighter, steadier, and more elegant than anything a wax candle has ever produced. Within a season, none of them will tolerate ordinary candlelight in their own homes again. Once the addiction sets in, and it always does among people who define themselves by what they can afford that others cannot, the actual money arrives. It arrives through refined fuel refills sold at whatever price their vanity can bear. A rare alchemical fluid, replenished discreetly, priced without any real ceiling. It would move quietly enough that Duke Golden Lion's people would have no obvious complaint to hang a blockade on. I told Sylvie to make sure Serena understood that the genuine Violet Merchant Guild was not part of this plan in any form. It should be allowed to collapse on the schedule our mother's mismanagement had already set for it. Propping up a business that has been rotting for years out of nothing but sentiment is the kind of decision that feels honorable and performs terribly. I have never had much patience for decisions that only feel good. I want to be clear that this was not cruelty toward Serena, whatever it looked like on paper. The entire architecture of the plan existed to keep her personally solvent while the company that never respected her was left to answer for its own debts. Somewhere under the calculation, I recognized that she was the only member of my family who had written to me as anything other than an obligation. That recognition earned her a level of effort I would not have spent on Arthur or our mother if they had begged. I did not write any of that sentiment into my reply. Serena needed instructions she could execute, not a younger brother's feelings dressed up as strategy. Sylvie, still turning the plan over as she wrote it down, raised the objection I had been waiting for her to reach on her own. She reminded me that we had already promised exclusive distribution rights for lighting technology to the Golden Eagle Merchant Guild, our existing trade partner. She asked how Nightingale could exist without breaking that agreement outright. I told her the agreement would remain fully intact. Nightingale and Golden Eagle were never going to sell the same product to the same customers in the first place. Golden Eagle would receive exactly what the contract promised them: full, open, legal distribution rights to a lighting product built around this technology. What they would actually manufacture and sell, though, would be a cruder version. Mass-produced brass lanterns, without the fine adjustable wick or the polished chimney glass. Solid and functional, priced for caravan guards, mine owners, and ordinary tradesmen rather than nobility. Still profitable, still entirely honest under the letter of our agreement. Still exactly the kind of product that draws attention in the marketplace, rather than avoiding it. That visibility was the entire design, not an accident of it. A merchant house suddenly selling a lighting product that outperforms every candle and oil lamp on the market is going to draw scrutiny. The Duke has spent a year strangling every trade route he can reach, and I wanted every ounce of that scrutiny landing on Golden Eagle, rather than anywhere near my sister. Let Duke Golden Lion investigate, pressure, or retaliate against Golden Eagle over an open, legal, boringly conventional product line. He will spend his attention exactly where I want it spent. While his people comb through Golden Eagle's warehouses and shipping manifests looking for whatever advantage worries him, Nightingale operates in a market he is not even watching. The aristocracy's private luxury spending has never once been the Duke's concern. In his mind, that market belongs to vanity and gossip, not to trade wars. By the time anyone in the capital connects an obscure company called Nightingale to a settlement 200 kilometers away run by a disgraced younger son, half the countesses in the city will already be paying absurd prices to keep their private chambers lit. Sylvie went quiet for long enough that I checked whether she was still listening. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular flatness of someone recalculating an entire opinion from scratch. She said that the man the capital remembered as a useless drunk with a talent for wasting his father's money had apparently been wearing that reputation as a mask the entire time. I told her that a mask only works if the person wearing it never explains the trick. I told her she should keep that observation to herself rather than let it travel back through any of her own channels. She agreed, though I noted the faint, reluctant respect in how quickly she agreed. It was the kind that does not come from fear alone. I turned back to the lamp, still burning steady on the table between the cooling fuel batches. I thought about how far a single working invention could travel once you stopped thinking of it as a lamp. Start thinking of it instead as two separate weapons pointed in two separate directions. One weapon draws fire in the open market under a name that can absorb the damage. The other moves in silence through drawing rooms and dinner parties, capturing spending habits the Duke believes belong to him, simply because the people spending it are noble. Both weapons come from the same 12 failed batches of coal tar. Both come from the same stubborn glassworks apprentices who kept blowing out chimneys until one of them finally held. I finished dictating my reply to Serena before the fuel batch had fully cooled. I kept the instructions specific enough to execute and vague enough that no courier who intercepted it could reconstruct the whole plan from a single page. I did not sign it the way our family usually signs correspondence, with titles and formal distance. I noticed that omission myself only after Sylvie had already sealed the pouch. Whatever that omission meant, I let it stand rather than call for the letter back. The evening's business was not finished yet. An intelligence adjutant was waiting outside the compound with a scroll case under one arm. He held the patient posture of a man who has learned not to interrupt me while I am working with fire. He had once run a corner of the Red Leaf Thieves Guild before I bought his loyalty with a salary steadier than anything crime had ever paid him. He had turned out to be worth every coin of it. He waited until I stripped off the gas mask and stepped clear of the retorts before he approached. That told me the report in his hand was not the kind he wanted to deliver through a layer of leather and glass. He unrolled the scroll. He read through the summary in the clipped, unembellished tone Sylvie had trained her people to use. No drama added, no drama removed. The lesser nobility ringing Greywood town, he reported, had begun meeting with each other in a pattern his informants had never seen before Red Leaf's destruction. Barons who had spent years quietly competing for the same trade routes and the same tenant farmers were now exchanging letters. They were hosting each other for dinners that produced no obvious business. They were comparing notes on militia strength. Duke Golden Lion's pressure on the region had not eased since the blockade tightened around Serena's company. These smaller lords were caught in the same squeeze from a different angle, watching a former exile's settlement grow faster than any of their own holdings ever had. Fear does more to unite rivals than shared interest ever manages. Red Leaf's total collapse had apparently supplied enough fear to overcome years of mutual dislike among these particular barons. None of it had turned into open coordination yet. No shared banner, no formal alliance, nothing with a name I could put a report heading on. What existed instead was a pattern. Patterns are exactly the sort of thing Sylvie's network exists to catch before they harden into anything with teeth. I told the adjutant to keep watching. I told him to note every letter, every dinner, and every name that appeared more than once across separate reports. He rolled the scroll back up. He gave the kind of bow that a former thief gives when he still is not entirely certain the debt between us runs in his favor. He left the compound the way he came. I stood there afterward with the lamp still burning. The fuel batch was finally cool enough to bottle. A letter to my sister was already on its way north. A scroll's worth of smaller lords were quietly deciding that a former drunk's refugee town had grown into something worth banding together against. Every asset I had built that day sat on one side of the ledger: the committee, the harvest, the lamp, the plan for Nightingale. On the other side sat a ring of frightened barons doing the one thing frightened men reliably do when they cannot fight alone. I closed the ledger in my head for the night without balancing those two columns against each other, because some entries do not resolve in a single evening, and this one was only beginning to write itself. I keep a ledger for everything. The reports crossing my desk that spring read like an audit of another lord's bankruptcy in progress. In Baron Oakhaven's territory, planting season had become a performance staged for nobody. A field of men and women moved without moving anything forward. Word of Red Leaf's collapse had traveled faster than any royal decree. The barons clustered around my borders had gone pale with the kind of fear that makes men irrational. Duke Golden Lion leaned on every one of them. They answered by banning serfs from fleeing toward Greywood. They answered by banning the sale of anything stamped with my town's mark. A ban on ironware sounds decisive on parchment. It accomplishes nothing against a farmer who already owns a Greywood plow hidden under straw in his barn. Those lucky few worked their rows in half the time. Their steel did not snap on the first stubborn root. Their neighbors watched with the particular hatred reserved for a man who got out early. An old serf named Tom worked one of those neighboring fields. His plow was a wooden relic, patched with wire, groaning at every turn of the soil. Something in him had stopped pretending the effort was worth the ache in his back. He dropped his seed sack across the furrows however it landed. When the overseer's shadow crossed him, he lowered himself into the dirt. He let his chest heave like a bellows with a torn seam. Nobody rewarded a full day's labor with anything but another full day demanded tomorrow. Tom had done the math every peasant eventually does. He priced his effort at exactly what it earned him, which was nothing. I understand that calculation better than most lords ever will. I run the same one every morning before I decide what a person is worth to me. What started as one old man's private arithmetic spread through Oakhaven's fields the way a bad debt spreads through a merchant house. Quietly at first. Then all at once. Then impossible to hide from the books. Grain yields fell across barony after neighboring barony. Lords who had never once walked their own fields responded the only way they knew. They raised the tax owed on harvests that no longer existed. Higher taxes on lower yields produced exactly the outcome any first-year steward could have predicted. More serfs began slipping past their manor walls at night, aimed north toward my chimneys. The lords built gallows at the crossroads to answer that. Wooden frames went up at the exact junctions a fleeing family would have to cross. Corpses were left hanging as a ledger entry written in fear instead of ink. It bought them nothing lasting. A starving man does the same arithmetic Tom did. A rope at the crossroads only changes the odds, not the equation. I did not build those gallows. I did not write those tax decrees. And yet every noble along my border kept manufacturing my next generation of citizens with their own hands. Back in Grywood, none of this reached me as tragedy. I do not read intelligence reports as stories about suffering. I read them as disruptions to a supply chain I intend to own. One dispatch described a small uprising among Oakhaven's serfs. It had been put down before it produced anything I could use, so I filed it and set it aside. Another described a viscount 2 baronies over. He had taken to mutilating the feet of his blacksmiths so they could no longer walk far enough to desert him. A man who cripples his own craftsmen to keep them working is a man who is already lost. He has not yet noticed the shape of his own ruin. A third report interested me more. A baron along the river had strung his soldiers across a crossing and turned a public ferry into a private toll booth. One of my shipments had been seized inside a week of the blockade going up. I do not tolerate a cut supply line any more than I tolerate a debtor who stops answering letters. A border noble had thought he could tax my goods without consequence. That offended me on a level closer to instinct than policy. Sylvie brought the map to my desk herself rather than sending it through a courier. That told me, before she opened her mouth, that she considered the matter urgent. She traced the river crossing and 2 overland roads with one finger. Every one of these blockading nobles sat on ground that mattered, a ferry, a bridge, a pass between 2 hills that any cart bound for Grywood had to use. Her argument was simple and correct. Our furnaces and workshops were consuming raw material faster than our internal roads could supply. Letting these blockades stand would choke growth we had already promised to our own craftsmen. I told her I had no intention of letting anything stand. She asked whether that meant soldiers. Soldiers were the expensive answer, and the stupid one. A column of Grywood men marching into a rival baron's land would hand Duke Golden Lion the exact justification he had been fishing for since the day Red Leaf fell. An open war costs me coin. It costs me lives I have spent years cultivating into productive assets. It hands my enemies a story about the upstart lord who invades his neighbors. I preferred to let these baronies rot from the inside. The way a granary rots when the seal on the door is broken and nobody notices the damp until the walls collapse. We already ran routes for serfs fleeing across contested borders, quiet paths marked by trusted guides. I widened the incentive. Any guide who let an entire village out at once earned permanent housing and standing inside Grywood, rather than a one-time bounty. Somewhere underneath the transaction, I recognized the shape of an idea I would never say aloud in those words. Something close to freeing labor itself from the men who claimed to own it. I did not care about liberty as a principle. I cared about it as inventory. Every serf who crossed into my territory arrived as a future taxpayer, a future soldier, a future set of hands at a forge. I intended to collect on all 3. Alongside the escape routes, I had a second instrument in development. One considerably less patient than a guide walking a family through the dark. Ella and the Smiths at Copperhammer had spent months on a project they referred to only as the byproduct. It was born out of failed experiments with mining charges. I had asked for a live demonstration before I committed a single coin further. We rode out to an abandoned quarry on the edge of Greywood Land. It sat far enough from any settlement that a mistake would only cost me equipment and pride. Ella packed a sealed barrel with a black, gritty powder her workshop had refined through a dozen failed batches. She set it beside a row of steel plates dressed to mimic a knight's breastplate and shield. A length of fuse ran from the barrel's bung to a stake driven 30 paces back. Copperhammer lit it with a torch before retreating behind a shield of stacked timber. The fuse burned with a small, unimpressive hiss. It was the kind of sound that gives no warning of what follows it. When the barrel went, the ground under my boots jumped before the sound reached me. A column of dirt and smoke rose out of the quarry floor, as if the earth itself had been struck from below. Where the barrel had sat, there was a crater deep enough to bury a cart in. The steel plates meant to simulate armor lay scattered and torn open, as if some enormous hand had peeled them like fruit. Sylvie stood beside me through all of it. I have watched her face through duels, through skirmishes, through the aftermath of Redleaf's defeat. I had never once seen it go the color it went that afternoon. She had trained since childhood to read danger in a blade's arc, or the pull of a spell circle forming in the air. None of that training had prepared her for a wooden barrel with no caster attached to it. A battle mage's fireball, she told me once the ringing left her ears, announces itself. A caster needs time and focus and a visible working. A trained knight can read the signs and move before the flame lands. This had no caster, no working, no warning beyond a hiss she would not have thought to fear. The destruction it produced outmatched anything she had watched a mage summon on a battlefield. Even shaken, she did not stop being a soldier. Within a few breaths, she had turned the demonstration over in her head and started listing its faults the way she would critique a green recruit's stance. The barrel itself was heavy and awkward. It was difficult to move quickly or hide close enough to a real target without drawing attention. The fuse gave an enemy time. A knight or mage worth the name would hear that hiss, see the smoke, and put distance or a shield of solid stone between themselves and the blast before it went off. Against an expert combatant, someone trained to sense danger and answer it in a heartbeat, this weapon would likely fail to land a killing blow. She said so without softening it for my benefit, which is one of the reasons I keep her close. I told her she was right and I meant it. I had not built the byproduct to kill a single knight in single combat. And a late knight is the most expensive asset in this world to produce. 20 years of training from childhood. Fed on rare magical beast meat that costs more than most farms earn in a season. Armored in enchantments that draw on bloodlines and workshops most lords will never afford. Even fully grown into that investment, a single knight tires. He can hold a line against a few dozen ordinary soldiers before exhaustion turns him into a target rather than a wall. A barrel of my black powder costs under 5 silver coins in raw material. It requires no bloodline, no talent, no decade of discipline. Any laborer with steady hands can mix a batch inside half a day if I write the instructions plainly enough. I did not need the byproduct to kill the knight standing on the wall. I needed it to remove the wall, the granary behind it, the barracks beside it. I needed it to remove the confidence of every ordinary soldier who had assumed his lord's fortress made him safe. No noble, however, gifted it with a sword, or however deep his family's magic runs, survives on personal strength alone once his supply lines are ash and his own serfs have stopped believing the walls will hold. Take away the food, the coin, and the terrified compliance of the common men underneath him. Even the finest knight in the world becomes one very well-armored, very hungry man standing alone in a ruin. With that settled in my mind, I chose my first target from among the border lords choking my river trade. The choice took me no more than a glance at Sylvie's map. Barren White River had strung an iron chain boom across the water at the narrowest point of the crossing. He had built a squat stone fortress on the near bank. He had stationed armed guards to collect a toll that had nothing to do with maintenance and everything to do with greed. Every barge I sent downriver that season either paid an extortion fee that erased half its profit, or turned back and added weeks to a delivery my furnaces were waiting on. I had Copperhammer prepare 4 oak barrels of the byproduct, sealed tight and packed with enough powder to answer the Baron's toll booth in full. Rather than send a warship or a raiding party, I chose a small, decrepit boat. It was the kind a river patrol would dismiss on sight, its hull patched and gray, its sail a rag that had clearly seen better decades. 2 men from my quiet operations volunteered for the run. They dressed as ragged smugglers down on their luck, carrying nothing on them that would connect the boat back to Greywood if it were searched. The plan asked them to drift the boat into the blockade. Let the guards do exactly what greedy guards do. Be 100 strides downriver in the water before anyone understood what 4 oak barrels actually held. On the morning they set out, the tax official stationed at White River's crossing had already spent weeks in a foul mood. Toll revenue had thinned out as word of the blockade spread and honest traders simply stopped coming. He spotted the decrepit little boat drifting with the current well before it reached the chain. Greed did the rest of the thinking his mind required. He assumed smugglers, assumed hidden goods worth confiscating. He ordered his men to force it against the bank before it could reach open water on the far side. The 2 men aboard played their part with the kind of desperate, wide-eyed pleading that convinces a guard he holds all the power in the exchange. They offered a handful of coppers as a token bribe and begged to be let through. The official refused the bribe outright, certain there was more to take. He ordered his men to pry open the hold and see what the smugglers were so eager to hide. The instant the hold's boards came up, the 2 smugglers slipped a rope they had kept coiled at their feet. They dropped over the side without a splash worth noticing. They swam hard for the far bank against the current. The guards, absorbed in the barrels, did not register the 2 men vanishing until it no longer mattered to anyone what they thought. Inside the hold sat 4 large oak barrels reeking of something none of the guards recognized. A length of fuse was already burning down toward the nearest one, lit before the smugglers ever dove. This world had never seen black powder before that morning. The men staring down at a hissing cord had no framework for what it meant. One guard, in the particular kind of confusion that gets men killed, planted his boot on the spark and pressed down. He treated it like a campfire ember rather than the lit fuse of a weapon he could not name. The powder did not care what he believed it was. The first barrel went. The chain reaction that followed tore through the other 3 inside a heartbeat. It turned the boat and the men standing on it into a column of fire and splinters visible from both banks. The tax official and every guard who had boarded the vessel died before the sound of the blast finished traveling to the fortress walls behind them. That shockwave crossed the water and struck the stone fortress itself. Cracks opened through walls that had stood since long before Baron White River claimed the crossing as his own. Soldiers posted along the ramparts, men who had done nothing that morning but collect an unlawful toll on my lord's orders, went down with the stonework crumbling beneath their boots. The ballistae mounted along the wall, the weapons meant to sink exactly this kind of intruding boat, splintered where they stood. Their frames snapped by a force no engineer in that fortress had ever accounted for. The iron chain boom stretched across the river, forged thick enough to stop a war galley, whipped once under the pressure of the blast. It snapped clean through, dropping into the current with a sound like a struck bell. By the time the smoke cleared off the water, the crossing that had strangled my river trade for weeks stood open. Its fortress was cracked, its toll collectors dead, its chain resting on the riverbed where it could threaten nothing. 1 boat, 4 barrels, 2 men who never stopped swimming. A blockade that had cost me shipments for weeks was gone inside a single morning, at a price cheaper than a season's worth of the tolls it had been collecting from me. I read the report of it back in Greywood with the same flat attention I give any successful transaction. I will admit the number in the ledger column marked cost pleased me more than most. While the river crossing burned, a quieter kind of demolition was underway in the capital. It took weeks before the full accounting of it reached me through Serena's letters. My sister had been building something she called the Nightingale Trading Company under a name that traced back to nobody she actually was. It was a front designed to move through the capital's social circles without ever once wearing the Bohemia name. She had chosen a down-on-his-luck viscount as her public face. He was a man with a title worth more than his purse and a debt large enough that my silver bought his complete cooperation without argument. Her instructions to him were exact. From what I later learned, he followed them without deviation, which is the only kind of employee I have any respect for. He arranged an intimate gathering among 6 noblewomen known across the capital for one shared trait. an appetite for anything that let them outshine each other before anyone else had it first. To each of them he presented a kerosene lamp as a gift free of charge. He wrapped it in language about rare craftsmanship and a light unlike any candle could produce. The lamps performed exactly as Serena intended. They threw a clean, steady glow that made every candle in the room look like a relic from a poorer century. The women lit them that evening and watched their own parlors transform. I am told more than one of them refused to let a servant blow the flame out before dawn. Only once every woman in that circle had grown attached to a light she could not imagine living without did the Viscount mention something, almost as an afterthought. The lamp itself required a particular refined fuel to keep burning. He described it as a rare extract drawn from creatures found only in the deep sea, scarce, difficult to transport. It was priced at 2 gold coins for a bottle smaller than a woman's palm. 2 gold coins would feed a laboring family for a full year. Not one of the 6 women blinked at the figure, because none of them had ever measured anything by what a laboring family needed. Vanity does its own arithmetic. In a room full of noblewomen competing for whose parlor glowed brightest at the next gathering, the price became proof of value rather than a warning against the purchase. They bought immediately. Word of the lamps spread through the capital's social circuits, the way any status object spreads among people who fear being the last to have one. Deposits arrived faster than the Viscount could log them. Serena kept every coin of it locked away from prying eyes, including, for the moment, mine, until the operation had grown too large to hide. She wrote to me afterward that the whole scheme rested on one lesson she credited to a letter I had sent her long before any of this began. Nothing offered for free costs less than what it is designed to make you need. I recognized my own thinking in her words. I felt something closer to pride than I generally allow myself to feel about anyone, sister included. She added one more detail to her report that I read twice before setting the letter down. The capital's commercial court had formally declared the Violet Merchant Guild bankrupt. It was the very company our family once built, and the one Duke Golden Lion had spent years and considerable coin working to destroy. Golden Lion was, by every account reaching Serena's ears, celebrating that bankruptcy openly among his allies. He treated it as proof that the Bohemia name had been erased from the capital's trade for good. He had no idea that while he toasted the death of an old company bearing our name, a new one he had never heard of was already draining silver out of his own social circle, one vain and glowing parlor at a time. Serena locked the ledger away that night with the particular satisfaction of someone who has watched an enemy congratulate himself over the wrong grave, and did not send word of it beyond the letter that eventually reached my desk. My river blockade solution had a side effect nobody warned me about. It arrived at my gates in the form of a flood. Word of Baron White River's fortress crumbling to nothing had traveled faster than any courier I employed. It moved through serf villages like a lit fuse. Tom was the name of an old serf I had catalogued months earlier as a low-value asset. A man too broken by Baron Oakhaven's whip to be worth recruiting, or so my ledger claimed. I had written him off as dead weight, the kind that starves quietly on someone else's books. I was wrong about that. Being wrong about an asset's true value is the only kind of mistake I enjoy making. Tom broke the night the news of the blockade's destruction reached his village. He did not break alone. He gathered his daughter first, a girl too young to understand why her father was shaking. Then he gathered his neighbors. Then he gathered the neighbors of the next village over. 2 villages emptied themselves into the dark that night. Nearly 2,000 serfs walked in a column that had no business surviving the trip. My intelligence network found them before Baron Oakhaven's patrols did. That is the entire reason they still had throats when they reached my border. Smuggling 2,000 bodies past a hostile lord's checkpoints in a single night is not cheap. I paid every silver of it without blinking. A serf who owes me his life is a serf who will never again be a rounding error on someone else's tax sheet. They came down the last hill toward Greywood in the gray hour before dawn. Tom later told one of my clerks what he expected to find. Another camp of desperate strangers, waiting to rob them of what little they carried. What he found instead was brick. Chimneys, straight and mortared, breathing smoke into a sky that had no business looking that orderly above a town of refugees. Streets laid out in lines instead of the crooked animal paths he was used to. Gutters cut along the edges to carry off the rain. He stopped walking. The column behind him nearly folded into itself before someone nudged him forward again. At the reception plaza, my guards were already working the crowd. Tom braced for the only kind of crowd control he had ever known, the kind that involves a boot and a shout. Instead, he watched men in graywood colors sort 2,000 strangers into a single moving line. Nothing but patience and a length of rope strung between posts. Nobody screamed at anyone to move faster. Nobody struck a child for crying. The guards repeated the same 3 instructions over and over. The way a man repeats a prayer he has said so many times it no longer costs him effort. Tom reached the front of the line still expecting a demand. Payment, labor, something owed before anything was given. What he got was a spray of pale liquid across his scalp and his daughter's hair. A solution my chemists brewed specifically to kill lice and the diseases lice carry, before anyone ever set foot past the gate. He got a strip of tin stamped with a number, hung on a cord around his neck. A temporary identity tag that meant nothing to him and everything to my administrators trying to track 30,000 souls without losing count. He got pointed toward a bathhouse where hot water ran from pipes instead of buckets. He stood under it longer than he needed to. He had forgotten what clean water felt like when it was not also freezing. Then he got a bowl. Oatmeal, plain and thin by any noble's standard, steaming in a wooden bowl. Pressed into his hands by a girl no older than his own daughter. No lord in his village's memory had ever fed a fleeing serf before demanding something in return. Tom sat down on the cold stone of the plaza with that bowl in his lap. He cried in a way his daughter had never seen him cry. Not from grief. From the specific shock of being treated like he still counted as a person. I did not watch this scene myself. I do not waste my own hours standing in reception lines when I have clerks whose entire function is to stand in reception lines for me. But the reports reached me by mid-morning. I read them the way I read every intake report, as a column of numbers with a story attached that I mostly ignore. 2,000 new bodies, mostly able and willing. Arriving with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a debt of gratitude they would spend the rest of their lives repaying in labor, taxes, and loyalty. That is not charity. That is the cheapest acquisition price I have ever paid for 2,000 units of workforce. I would smuggle out every serf village in the duchy if Baron Oakhaven's patrols would let me. I climbed the highest terrace of my castle that same evening to watch the plaza empty out. The way a factory owner walks the floor at closing to see what the day actually produced. Lanterns strung along the new streets picked out the shapes of families finding their assigned housing. Small fires lit for the first hot meal some of these people had cooked themselves in months. From that height the whole town looked like a machine running exactly as designed. Gears turning, belts moving, nothing jamming. The notification arrived in the corner of my vision the way it always does. Cold text laid over a warm scene. Territory population had crossed 30,000. Projected daily income from that population had crossed 30,000 silver a day. That figure factored tax rates, production output, and trade margins. 30,000 silver, every single day, without me lifting a finger past the initial investment. That is the kind of number that would make a sitting duke reconsider his own competence. It is passive income in the truest sense, the kind of number ledgers are built to worship. I stood there worshipping it in my own quiet way, which involves no smiling and a great deal of mental arithmetic. Sylvie found me on that terrace before I finished the arithmetic. She did not come up to admire the view. She came up with a problem dressed in the clothing of a celebration. 30,000 new residents sounds like 30,000 new workers, she told me. The truth sitting underneath that number was uglier. A large share of the new arrivals were old, sick, missing limbs, or otherwise physically unable to survive a shift in the mines or the smelters. Heavy industry cannot absorb a labor force it cannot use. Every idle pair of hands in a crowded town is a pair of hands with time to get into trouble. Even among the able-bodied, the mines and the furnaces were saturating. They were filling every slot faster than we could open new ones. Unemployment in a town this size is not a moral failing. It is a security liability, and I have never once let a liability sit unaddressed out of sentiment. I did not need new heavy industry. I needed light industry, work that did not require a strong back. Only a steady pair of hands and enough patience to sit at a wheel for a full shift. I sent word down to Copperhammer's production department within the hour. Greywood already had spinning wheels scattered through its old weaving sheds. Relics nobody had bothered to improve because nobody had needed to. I wanted them redesigned, pedal-driven instead of hand-cranked. Fitted with a flywheel to keep the spindle turning smoothly between pushes of the foot. A design like that lets one worker's legs do what used to take both hands and constant attention. More thread, faster, from workers who could never have survived a shift underground. I opened the new textile floor specifically to women and to the elderly. The exact population everyone else in this world treats as dead weight the moment their bodies stop being useful for war or for mining. I flooded the northern cloth markets with cheap, Greywood ironware once already. Undercutting every blacksmith's guild within 3 duchies until they either matched my price or closed their forges. Cheap cloth was the same play with a different loom. If every merchant north of the river could buy Greywood thread for less than it cost their own weavers to spin it, that market would belong to me. The same way the ironware market already did. No labor sits idle in my territory, not the strong backs and not the weak ones. An idle worker earns me nothing, and a working one, however frail, earns me something every single day. That is not kindness dressed up as policy, whatever Sylvie chooses to call it when she reports the numbers back to the guild registry. It is simply the only version of this economy that does not waste an asset I already paid to bring inside my walls. Far south, inside walls considerably older than mine, Duke Golden Lion was not thinking about spinning wheels. He was reading a report about a stone fortress that no longer existed. The reading was not going well for the men standing near him. Baron River's toll blockade had been 50 armed men behind stone walls thick enough to shrug off a siege engine. It had been erased in a single night. The Duke's advisors offered him the only explanation their imaginations could produce. Some manner of ancient alchemical weapon had been unearthed and turned against the Baron's men. None of them considered the possibility that an exiled nobleman running a refugee camp had simply built something new. In their world, nothing new gets built, only old things get rediscovered. I let them believe in ghosts and lost formulas. A duke chasing legends spends his resources in exactly the wrong direction. Every silver he wastes chasing my gunpowder's imaginary ancestry is a silver he does not spend chasing me. His second piece of bad news was worse, because it was not about a weapon he could dismiss as sorcery. Despite crippling the Violet Merchant Guild, the trade artery I had leaned on for months, my cash flow had not slowed by any measure his spies could detect. Worse still, a wave of cheap brass windproof lamps had been carving enormous chunks out of certain profits. Sold under the banner of the Golden Eagle Merchant Guild. Carved specifically from the candle and beeswax guilds as his own family held a controlling interest in. A duke does not measure insult by the size of the wound. He measures it by whose pocket the wound is bleeding from. This wound was bleeding from his. He ordered a crackdown, immediate and total, aimed squarely at the Golden Eagle Merchant Guild. Ships seized in harbor before they could unload. Warehouses raided by soldiers who did not bother reading the inventory before they started smashing crates. He wanted the Golden Eagle name broken publicly enough that no other guild would dare undercut a Golden Lion candle again. He never once considered that his own wife was 2 floors above him in that same castle at that exact hour. She was standing over a lamp she called the Tears of the Goddess of Light. A piece of glasswork so far beyond a brass windproof lamp that comparing the two would insult the lamp. Her face in its light had the particular glow of a woman who has found a luxury nobody else in her circle owns yet. She was, at that same hour, arranging payment for more of its fuel through a black market contact operating under the name Nightingale. A front Serena ran with a discretion that made the Duke's own spy network look like a village gossip circle. Every coin she spent through that channel was a coin flowing straight back to Greywood. Untouched by tariffs, untouched by inspection, untouched by the husband currently ordering warships against a decoy. I built this arrangement on exactly that principle. A wealthy man defending his pride will always chase the visible target and never think to search his own household. The Golden Eagle Merchant Guild absorbed every ounce of Golden Lion fury meant for me. Ships and warehouses and reputation sacrificed like a limb offered up so the rest of the body survives. Meanwhile, the real operation continued without a single interruption. The high-end trade running fuel and luxury glasswork straight into a duke's private chambers. A diversion only works when the man being diverted never suspects there are 2 tracks running at once. Golden Lion, for all his temper, has never once suspected he is chasing the wrong train. Back in Greywood, gunpowder and crossbows already felt like yesterday's problem to me. Every weapon I had fielded so far was a stopgap, useful, profitable, but not the thing I actually wanted sitting in my arsenal. I wanted a cannon. A cannon starts with a barrel, and a barrel starts with a hole. A hole that has no business being as straight and smooth as I needed it to be. I sat down with copper hammer and sketched a steel tube. Walls thick enough to survive an internal blast. A bore running the full length of the rod with a precision our current tools had never been asked to produce. Copper hammer looked at the drawing the way a man looks at a debt he already knows he cannot pay. He told me plainly that drilling a hole that long, that straight, and that smooth through solid steel was not a matter of skill. It was a matter of physics his forge had no way of satisfying yet. Our metalworking, he reminded me, could barely hold a tolerance fine enough for a decent musket barrel, let alone something this large. I told him we were going to attempt it anyway. Not because I doubted his assessment of our limits. Because I have never once built anything in this world by staying inside limits other people accepted as permanent. I described the rig I wanted, a water wheel turning a drill bit mounted on a fixed carriage. The river doing double duty as both the power source driving the bit and the coolant keeping the steel from warping under the friction. Water flows for free, and a river never tires the way a team of men swinging hammers eventually does. I told him to expect failure, plenty of it. Cracked rods and crooked bores and wasted steel piling up beside the rig for weeks before a single usable barrel came out the other end. A high scrap rate is not a failure of the plan, it is the plan's cost of admission. I have never begrudged an investment its early losses when the return waiting on the other side is a weapon nobody else on this continent can build. A working cannon barrel would not just be one more piece of hardware in my armory. It would be the seam between one era of warfare and the next. I intended Greywood to be standing on the correct side of that seam when it opened. Copper Hammer built the rig on a tributary feeding off the White River. He chose the site for a channel narrow enough to drive the water wheel hard without flooding the workshop around it. The first steel column went into the carriage, clamped and aligned. The bit began its slow bite into metal that had never expected to be tested this way. It worked in the sense that matters most to me, which is that it did not fail outright. River water spun the wheel turned the bit crept forward one shaving of steel at a time. The same water carried the heat away before it could ruin the temper of the rod. What it did not do was work fast. Days passed per barrel, the bit advancing at a pace that made every other production line in Greywood look frantic by comparison. I accepted the slowness as the price of doing something nobody else had ever attempted. I might have gone on accepting it indefinitely if Copper Hammer had not flagged a second problem underneath the first. The water flow itself, he told me, was weakening. Not on one bad day, but steadily week over week. The tributary was carrying less volume past the rig than it had when construction started. I went to look at it myself rather than trust the report secondhand. A resource problem that gets misdiagnosed early tends to become a catastrophe later. What I found was not a problem with the tributary. It was a problem with everything drawing from the same larger system that fed it. Greywood's population had crossed 30,000 and kept climbing. Every one of those 30,000 people needed water to drink, to cook, to wash. My own hygiene laws made that demand worse before they made anything better. Mandatory daily bathing and soap use for every worker, coal handlers and chemical workers held to an even stricter standard. All of it enforced with fines for anyone caught skipping it. I had written those laws because a workforce riddled with disease is a workforce that dies on my ledger before it ever pays back its recruitment cost. I still believe that math without reservation. But every bath drawn, every load of laundry washed, every dose of soap rinsed away was still water pulled from the same wells and channels. Feeding the mines and the furnaces, and now the drilling rig as well. Blast furnaces drink water by the barrel to keep from cracking under their own heat. Coal washing drinks it to keep the dust from choking half the district. Irrigation drinks it to keep the fields that feed 30,000 mouths from turning to dust themselves. Add a water-powered drill rig gnawing through steel around the clock, and the math stopped balancing. I walked the irrigation channels on the east side of town myself. I saw what the reports had only hinted at. Water levels sitting visibly lower than they should have been for the season, mud showing at the edges of channels that used to run full. Wells that had never given the town trouble before were coming up slower, buckets taking longer to fill. Old women at the pump complaining to each other in a tone I recognized instantly. The tone of people watching a resource they assumed was permanent start to behave like it is not. Sylvie brought me the number that turned my suspicion into a deadline. Without rationing water to the Eastern District's workers, she told me the chemical plant would run out of cooling water. Forced to shut its lines within a month. A month is not a long runway for a facility that manufactures a meaningful share of my explosives and my more delicate compounds. Her proposed fix was the obvious one, the one any accountant would reach for first. Cut consumption where it is cheapest to cut, which in practice meant rationing water to the laborers living closest to the plant. I refused her before she finished laying out the details. Cutting a worker's water ration to solve a shortage is not a solution. It is a loan against the future taken out at a punishing interest rate. A workforce denied clean water gets sick, gets slow, and eventually gets replaced at a cost far higher than whatever the ration saved. I have called that kind of thinking a false economy before. I will keep calling it that for as long as lords keep making the same mistake and wondering why their machine breaks down early. I did not argue Sylvie out of the idea only to leave her with nothing in its place. I walked her south of town to a site she had clearly heard rumors about but never seen with her own eyes. Thousands of laborers were already at work there, cutting a basin into the earth wide and deep enough to swallow a small lake. The walls were being sealed with cement to keep the water from bleeding straight back into the ground. The design was simple in concept and enormous in scale. A reservoir built to catch the runoff of the rainy season and to divert a portion of the river's main channel into storage instead of letting all of it run past the town unused. Beside the basin, a second structure was rising, a purification facility built around nothing more exotic than layered sand, gravel, and charcoal that had been burned down to the right consistency. Stacked in beds that would strip the mud and the sickness out of river water and groundwater alike before it ever reached a household. Sylvie stood at the edge of the pit for a long while without saying anything. She was taking in a project sized for a duchy rather than a single frontier town. When she spoke again, it was with genuine respect, and also with the next problem. That is the shape every conversation with her eventually takes. Clean water sitting in a reservoir south of town does nothing for a family living north of it. Or for a factory floor 3 streets over from the nearest well. Carrying it by hand, bucket by bucket, across a town this size would eat an army of laborers just moving water instead of producing anything. That defeats half the purpose of building the reservoir in the first place. I told her she had found my current headache exactly. I needed pipe, real pipe, laid underground and running to every district that mattered. Every material I could think of came with its own way of failing me. Cast iron pipe would do the job, but it costs more than this early treasury can absorb at the scale I would need. It rusts from the inside over years, shedding flakes of corrosion into the very water it is meant to keep clean. Hollowed wood pipe is cheap and easy for any carpenter in this town to produce. But it rots in the ground within a few seasons, swells, splits, and leaks more water than it delivers. There was a third option sitting in the back of my mind that I did not say aloud to Sylvie. Explaining it would have meant explaining a piece of history she has no way of knowing. Lead pipe is soft, easy to shape, resistant to rot. Every engineer in every world I have ever read about eventually reaches for it as the obvious answer. I am the only person standing in that reservoir pit who knows what a slow accumulation of lead in the blood and the water supply did to an empire on the world I came from. A poisoning so gradual that nobody alive at the time ever connected the dying nobility to the pipes carrying their drinking water. I will build this town on many things. I refuse to build it on a foundation that quietly kills its own people a spoonful at a time across 2 generations. So I stood at the edge of an empty reservoir with Sylvie waiting for an answer I did not have. Cast iron too expensive, wood too fragile, lead ruled out for reasons I could never explain to her without sounding like a madman. Every problem I have solved in this town, so far bent to enough capital or enough stubbornness applied in the right direction. This one was not bending. I needed a material science this world had not produced yet. No amount of silver or willpower was going to conjure it out of the ground on its own. What I needed, standing there staring into a pit that could hold a lake, but not yet deliver a single clean drop where it was needed, was not another laborer. I needed a chemist. The water problem sat on my desk like an insult. Iron rusted. Wood rotted. Lead poisoned the very people I meant to save with it. I had ledgers full of solutions to problems that money could buy. Here was one problem money alone would not touch. The material I needed did not exist yet in this world. So I set the problem aside. That is the discipline any competent investor learns, the discipline of shelving a bad trade instead of staring at it until it rots further. I went back to running a town that kept growing whether I had pipes for it or not. It was 2 men at my gates who broke the stalemate, though neither of them knew it at the time. Sylvie's report reached me before the men themselves did. That was exactly how I preferred information to travel, ahead of the people carrying it. 2 traveling alchemists, brothers by blood, had wandered into Greywood chasing a rumor. The rumor claimed our hills sat on some buried ruin left over from the old world. The story going around the border towns held that our smokeless coal and our lamps could only have come from a forgotten temple of magic. Merchants had taken to calling those lamps tears of the goddess of light. People will always prefer a legend to an invoice. The shorter of the 2 brothers, a blond man named Ed, walked through my streets with his nose lifted. He carried himself as though the mud might personally offend him. He took one look at the brick kilns and the coal smoke curling over the rooftops. He decided out loud that no true alchemy had ever been born from a town that smelled like a furnace. His brother Al said less and looked longer. That told me which of the 2 actually had a mind worth recruiting. Al crouched at a drainage channel near the market square. He traced the mortar lines with 2 fingers, quiet, the way a man studies a lock he cannot yet pick. He found no trace of magic anywhere in the stonework. That absence unsettled him more than any glowing rune would have. Sylvie intercepted them before they reached the second street. I had given her a standing order that applied to every scholar, tinkerer, and skilled mind who wandered into my territory. Find them, flatter them if flattery worked. Drag them to my study by whatever means did not involve actual rope. She told the brothers plainly that there were no ruins under Greywood town, that no ancient school had left its fingerprints here. Every invention in this town had come from one mind, she said, the mind of Baron Lorien Bohemia, and from nowhere else. Ed laughed at her, the short bark of a man who has already decided the conversation is beneath him. He said a secular baron with no feel for the deeper currents of alchemy could not possibly grasp truths that took mages a lifetime to sense. Sylvie only smiled at that. It is the particular smile she wears when she already knows how a conversation is going to end. She invited him to go find out for himself. I could hear even secondhand how much she enjoyed saying it. They came to my study within the hour, Ed leading with his chin, Al trailing behind with his eyes doing all the work his mouth wasn't. Ed wasted no time on courtesy. He wanted to know which ancient school I had stolen my kerosene formula from. He invoked the old principle of equivalent exchange as though it were a blade he could hold to my throat. Real transformation, he said, demanded real understanding of the material. No secular lord, he said, understood material the way a trained alchemist did. I found the accusation delightful rather than insulting. A man who thinks he is catching you in a lie is a man who has already agreed to listen. I did not defend myself. I taught him instead. For the next half hour I dismantled everything the 2 of them thought they knew about the substance of the world without raising my voice once. I drew carbon rings on scrap paper and explained how 6 atoms bound in a hexagon gave a molecule its stubborn stability. I explained distillation as separation by boiling point, nothing more. Oil and kerosene and tar peel apart at their own distinct temperatures because their molecules weigh differently, not because a spirit favors one over another. I explained bonds, how atoms share and steal electrons the way merchants share and steal customers. Those small transactions decide whether a substance turns brittle or bends. I explained states of matter as nothing more than how tightly molecules hold each other's hands. Solid, liquid, gas, no divine intervention required. I explained oxidation and reduction, rust and fire and breath. All of it belongs to the same family of exchange, dressed in different clothes. I called it the true alchemy. It is a system anyone can verify with their own hands and reproduce with their own tools, needing no gift, no bloodline, no whispered sense for the invisible. Ed stopped interrupting somewhere around the third explanation. By the fifth explanation he had gone pale and bright at once, a man watching the floor of his profession fall away and a new one rise beneath it. He asked question after question, faster than I could finish answering the last one. His voice climbed towards something close to delirium. Al said very little of it out loud. I watched him copy every diagram onto his own sleeve instead, in ink borrowed from my desk, his hand unsteady with what I can only call reverence. Once both of them leaned forward instead of standing at the doorway ready to leave, I made my actual request. I told them Greywood needed a material that did not yet exist anywhere in this world. It needed to be tough, waterproof, resistant to acid and rust, soft enough to shape and firm enough to hold its shape once cooled. In my old world we called such things by simpler names, but here I only described what I needed. I asked for a substance for pipes, for insulation for lining, born from combining what alchemy called elements in ways no alchemist here had ever tried. I was asking them, in effect, to invent an entire branch of chemistry that this world had never touched. I offered them the largest, best-funded independent laboratory on the continent. I offered materials without a spending ceiling I intended to mention out loud, and a promise that whatever they built would carry Greywood's name into every corner of the world that used it. I told them, and I meant every word of it, that the work would serve all of humanity, not only my treasury. It is one of the few sentences I have spoken in this life where my greed and my conscience point in exactly the same direction. Ed accepted before I had finished the offer, his hand out for mine like a man afraid the deal might vanish if he blinked. Sylvie stood by the window through the whole exchange, watching me the way she always watches me work. She told me once, much later, that she had come to understand my method fully that day. What outsiders read as respect and generosity was, underneath, another skilled worker fitted quietly into the machine. Permanent, willing, and grateful for the leash, she called it. She was not wrong. She was not the only one who saw it clearly, though she may be the only one who has never once resented me for it. I built them their laboratory on a hillside north of the furnaces, quiet enough for careful work and close enough for me to walk to on an afternoon. We called it, without much ceremony, Greywood's first laboratory, the first building on this continent that deserved the name. A water wheel below the hill turned a blower that pushed fumes out through ceramic ducts. No alchemist inside would spend a decade breathing the poison that shortened so many of their predecessors' lives. The workbenches wore lead linings against acid. I split the building into separate chambers so one exploding experiment would not take its neighbors down with it. Nothing about the place resembled the cramped, dark, choking dens where alchemists in this world usually worked. I made sure both brothers noted the difference on their first walk through it. I sent along a first shipment of reagents, rare imports I had been collecting for other purposes. I gave both brothers standing authority to interrupt any factory line in Greywood for custom glassware, or a precision tool built to their specification. Sylvie asked me, not for the last time, why I was funding open experimentation instead of ordering them outright to build me a pipe. I told her that the specific goal was rarely the most valuable thing to come out of research money spent without a leash. I did not tell her about the histories I remembered from my old life. I did not tell her about weapons research that stumbled into fertilizer. I did not tell her about a military project meant only to guide missiles that grew, decades later, into the backbone of an entire global economy. I only told her that a wide net catches fish a narrow net never sees. I told her I was buying a great many lottery tickets with money that would otherwise sit idle in a vault. Weeks passed. Ed in particular burned through reagents at a pace that made even my accountants flinch. He bought rare compounds by the pound where any sensible buyer bought them by the gram. He tested batch after batch of failed material that came out brittle as old bread or melted into a black, foul sludge the moment it met real heat. Sylvie brought me the ledgers herself one evening, her jaw tight. She pointed out the window at a pile of ruined waste sitting behind the laboratory like a small dark hill of its own. She said the sum we had spent could have funded another 1,000 iron guards, or fed the entire town for a month. She wanted to know if I still believed it was worth it. I did not hesitate. I told her that a genuine breakthrough insight is the single most expensive thing in this world. It is worth more than any number of trained soldiers, because soldiers can be replaced and a real idea often cannot. I laid the payoff out for her again plainly, so she would understand the shape of the bet. Corrosion-resistant pipe meant a real water network across the whole territory, fewer deaths from disease, furnaces that could cool themselves without a man standing over them all day. The same material drawn into thread could insulate wire. Pressed into sheets, it could line armor against a blade or a bolt. One success, I told her, was worth 100 kerosene lamps put together. I mentioned, in passing, that Duke Golden Lion had at last cracked down hard on the Golden Eagle Merchant Guild, the target he could actually see. What he found too late was that his own wife had been the real source of the bleeding all along. Her private taste for luxury lamps had quietly drained coin he never traced until the damage was already done. He managed to slow the losses. He did not stop them. That half-victory told me it was time to move my broader plan into its next phase regardless of what he did next. The brothers and I spent a good number of those weeks talking late into the night in the lab, wine on the bench between us. It was the kind of conversation that only happens once formality has worn off. It was in one of those conversations that I learned something that unsettled me more than I expected it to. Most advanced material work in this world required magic as a guiding hand, even something as ordinary as refining brass, to arrange matter at a level no eye could see. Ed and Al were not chemists wearing the name of alchemists, they were genuine second-tier mages. True mastery of their craft sat behind a gate I might not have the key to. I asked them to test me, out of plain curiosity, with a resonance crystal alchemists used to measure a person's aptitude. The crystal stayed dark in my hand. Al explained, carefully, that I was what alchemists call a silent body, a person unable, in every way that mattered, to sense or channel the elements that magic depends on. It explained, at last, why the young noble whose body I now wore had never shown a shred of knightly promise, despite the blood in his veins. I sat with that for longer than I let either brother see. If the boy who once owned this body had carried real talent, some quiet part of me understood, he likely would never have been exiled to a backwater like this in the first place. Sylvie found me still turning the crystal over in my hand later that night. She told me, without softening it, that my mind was the sharpest weapon she had ever stood beside, magic or none. I recovered faster than I expected to. If magic would not open certain doors for me, I decided, I would build a hammer heavy enough to take the doors off their hinges instead. I told the brothers I intended to build lenses fine enough to let me see what a mage senses without trying, and tools precise enough to cut matter exactly where I wanted it cut. I told them I meant to arm my iron guards with rifles that could drop a third-tier knight from 1,000 meters away. I refused to believe any magical shield could stop a shot moving faster than sound. I refused to believe any mage could stand upright in front of a real barrage of modern fire. This land's future, I told them, did not need magic's permission. It needed the roar of industry, and I intended to give it one. The two brothers looked at me differently after that night. I do not think it was fear. It was closer to the look men give a fire they are glad to be standing near instead of far from. Life in Greywood did not pause for any of this. By July it handed me a scene I had not planned for at all. The town held its first formal wedding that month, the first ceremony of its kind Greywood had ever hosted. I heard about it before I decided to attend it myself. The bride was Anna, a young woman my people had carried in from the frost the previous winter, more dead than alive, starved down to bone and shaking with a cold that should have killed her. The woman standing at that altar bore no resemblance to the one I remembered from that night, glowing now, steady on her feet, visibly carrying a child of her own. The groom was Pete, once a boy so thin I could count his ribs through his shirt, now a broad-shouldered young soldier in Iron Guard colors. Somewhere between his first meal in Greywood and this wedding day, Pete had done something the old feudal order would have called impossible. Through nothing but discipline and food eaten regularly enough to matter, he had awakened real battle Kai. He had crossed into the first tier as a fighter, with no noble blood behind him at all. Under the old lords, marriage for people like Anna and Pete meant nothing more than two exhausted bodies moving under the same leaking roof. No blessing, no ceremony, no promise that either of them would survive to see a child grown. Here it meant tables of real food, neighbors in their best clothes, and a crowd that laughed without watching the door for trouble. I walked in unannounced. The noise died the way a fire dies under a blanket. Pete started to drop to one knee the moment he saw me. I stopped him before his knee touched the ground. I told him a future knight's knees should bend for death, and for nothing smaller than that, certainly not for me. He straightened and snapped into the full formal salute of the Iron Guard. He swore his loyalty to me on the spot, in front of every guest at his own wedding. I spoke to the crowd after that, because a room full of people that quiet does not stay quiet without a reason given to it. I told them that in Greywood, unlike anywhere else they had lived before, they no longer needed to fear a child they could not feed. Then I told them what I had come to announce. From that day forward, every child born in Greywood town would have food and clothing provided by the town's own administration, from birth until they reached adulthood. The silence broke apart into something closer to disbelief, and then into something closer to weeping. I watched grown men and women who had once drowned newborns in famine winters to save the ration for the children already breathing outside. They stood there and cried openly at a promise they had never once been given the chance to make for themselves. I did not tell them what sat underneath that promise. They did not need to carry my ledger along with their joy. A child raised inside Greywood from birth, fed without interruption and taught without the old world's fear worn into their bones, grows into an adult worth more to this town than any traumatized refugee still flinching at the sound of a lord's boots. More children born here is not only mercy to me, it is a decades-long investment in a workforce, a garrison, and a population loyal before they can even walk. I dress the reasoning in ledger language when I am alone with it. I do not think that makes the care underneath it any less real. Weeks slipped by after that wedding the way they always do in a town with too much work and not enough hours. My attention moved on to a dozen other fires that needed tending. Far from Greywood, in territory that answered to a hostile baron, a piece of that work I had set in motion months earlier was still quietly running. My security chief Gareth had spent weeks undercover inside Oakhven, living as a vagrant, running the underground network that pulled refugees and defectors out of that baron's reach one careful step at a time. I know the shape of what happened to him that night, because I designed the system that made it possible, and because he told me every detail of it himself once he made it home. A disguised informant found him in a tavern filthy enough that most travelers would not have stayed for a second drink. The informant pressed a folded, sealed letter into his hand without a word passing between them. Gareth waited until the tavern emptied and the fire had burned down to coals before he unfolded it. The letter meant nothing to an untrained eye, a column of numbers that looked, to anyone who intercepted it, like a merchant's tally of debts. I had built the cipher myself around a single ordinary book, one Gareth kept close and one no censor in that barony would think twice about a vagrant owning. Each number pointed to a page, a line, a word. Only a man holding that exact printing of that exact book could turn the column back into language. It was a slow method, and a low one, nothing clever by the standards of my old world. In an empire where most soldiers could not read their own names, a simple substitution was already unbreakable in practice. Gareth decoded it line by line at that table, and I am told his hands were not steady by the end of it. The orders told him to halt the large-scale evacuations of ordinary refugees for the time being, the slow, careful work that had defined his last year of service to me. In its place, the letter gave him a new operation, one I had named the Star-Seeking Project. He was to spend whatever coin the work required, bribery included, and if bribery failed, extraction by force. He was to identify and quietly pull out any literate scholars, master blacksmiths, skilled carpenters, and trained surveyors hiding inside the baronies around him. Alongside that, within 2 months, he was to complete a full covert survey of 3 hostile territories at once, Oakhven, White River, and Ironcliff. I wanted exact night counts and infantry rotation schedules. I wanted the location of every granary and supply depot. I wanted the thickness of every wall worth measuring, and the timing of every guard rotation down to the hour. Gareth sat with that letter a long time after he finished decoding it, the coals dying beside him. The tavern stayed silent around a man who understood, before anyone else in that room ever could, what the numbers actually meant. No baron content to build quietly behind his own walls and wait would have written those orders. They read like the opening move of something else entirely, a war against the old nobility that had not yet been announced to a single soul outside my own study. He did not know when it would begin, or in what order the pieces would fall. He knew only that the letter in his hand was the first stone rolling loose before the slide. I have never asked him exactly what moved through him in that tavern, staring at coals and a burned scrap of paper that used to be my handwriting. I did not need to ask. I already knew, because I had felt something close to it myself the night I wrote the letter, the particular quiet that settles over a man right before he commits to something he cannot undo.